morning. My name is Nasser Yassin. I'm the Director of Research here in the Institute, the Issam Faris Institute for Public Policy and International Affairs. I also teach health policy in the School of Public Health. We're really honored to have you this morning. I know it's Monday morning, so it's not perhaps easy for everyone to come on time, but I'm sure it will pick up during the day. We're really glad to have you at our first conference this year in the Institute. This is the first conference as a big event we're having this year, and this is our 10th year. And I mentioned this not just to do some promotion to our institute, but throughout the last few years, we've really established ourselves as a space and as a place to dialogue and debate on critical policy issues. And today's conference is really a critical policy issue. As much as it is an economic and social issue, it touches a lot on the policy dimensions. I know it's complex these days in Lebanon to talk about policy-making processes with the issues in the level of government, the dysfunctional parliament, and we don't have yet a president, with a crisis of refugees, with a crisis of trying to find work for hundreds of thousands of people, Lebanese and non-Lebanese. So talking about this policy issue, as important as it is, it also highlights the complexity of touching on social policies as well as other relevant policies. And the topic of domestic workers perhaps is not a specialty to our institute, but also we're increasingly dealing with those critical social policy issues. We look as well at education and youth issues. We're looking as well at refugee issues, and this is an area where we need to expand. So we're glad to have this partnership with the ILO. This is not the first project we collaborate with the ILO on, so we're really glad to have you here as partners. We're also glad to have my colleague from the Ministry of Labour, whom I'll present in a minute, and of course my colleague from the British Embassy. Throughout the day, we'll have more discussions around the study, the report led by a good friend and colleague, Dr. Sausan Abdulrahim. I think it's important for academics to engage with relevant issues. I think we as academics tend sometimes to just focus on what makes us published in international arenas and journals. I think this is a critical issue, and I'm really glad. I want to congratulate Sausan for engaging in this issue. I know it won't be easy for her to get this published in an academic journal, but I'm sure she's really hitting on a very important subject, a subject that all of us as Lebanese and people who live in Lebanon have faced, have discussed, yet without a lot of evidence. So great work, Sausan and her colleagues, and I look forward to listen to her presentation. That's it for me. I'll just present now my colleagues. We'll go first with Hans van de Glent. He's a senior migration specialist at the ILO. And he's the senior migration specialist at the ILO for the Arab states. He's based here in Beirut, where he heads the implementation of the fair migration agenda in the region. He has over 21 years of experience on labor rights issues, including labor migration, trafficking, slavery, and child labor. This includes 19 years working with ILO in various duty stations and 2 years with the IOM. Today, he will kickstart this conference by representing the ILO's regional decent work as the officer in charge of this team in the region. Hans, I'll give you the floor.
Thank you very much. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, a lot of recent research, suggests that early childhood is a crucial period for the development of children. The important role of raising small children falls mostly on women's shoulders. Unfortunately, men, including myself, are often passive bystanders in this important process. Where women work and child care facilities are absent or very costly, this important role is often outsourced to domestic workers. In addition, domestic workers offer specialized care for the elderly and the disabled. They also clean and they cook what we eat every day. This is important work to family life and work that is vital to the functioning of the overall economy. And yet, it is often work that is not recognized as such. In Lebanon, domestic workers are mostly migrants from countries in Asia and also Africa. They are mostly women in their late 20s, and a significant number of them have their own children back home. Migrant domestic workers make up between 4 and 5% of the entire population of Lebanon, and an even higher percentage of the overall labor force. 5 years ago, countries from around the world adopted the ILO Convention 189 on domestic workers. They did so to recognize that domestic work is work, to reverse a history of exclusion from labor law protection, and to make decent work a reality for domestic workers. 2 years ago, ILO constituents adopted the ILO Fair Migration Agenda, which is about not only respecting the fundamental rights of migrant workers, but also offering them real opportunities for decent work. It is about recognizing the contribution that migrant workers make to their countries of origin, but also the countries of destination. And it is about a fair sharing of the prosperity that migrant workers help to create. Last year, the Sustainable Development Goals were adopted, and the international community pledged then that no one will be left behind. Target 5.4 of the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, furthermore highlights the need to recognize the value of unpaid care and domestic work. Today, actually, this day, countries across the globe are gathering in New York at a summit to adopt an outcome document on migration, in which they pledge to pay particular attention to the application of minimum labor standards to migrant workers, regardless of their status. All these global policy frameworks suggest that it is a very opportune time to gather here today at the AUB to exchange views on the plight of migrant domestic workers in Lebanon and the important care function that they offer in an evolving care economy. I would like to thank the Issam Institute for Public Policy and International Affairs at the AUB for hosting this important event in collaboration with the ILO, and for offering a platform for in-depth discussion on the fundamental role that migrant domestic workers play in caring for Lebanese families, including their children and including aging parents. This meeting will feature ample space to reflect on a range of recent publications, along with insights by a diverse group of participants. Today will also feature the launch of a report featuring the results of a survey of employer attitudes on migrant domestic workers. This survey was undertaken by AUB in collaboration with the ILO. The findings will be compared with earlier findings of a similar survey amongst migrant domestic workers. Both the report covering the perspectives of the employers and the other report covering the perspectives of workers have intertwined in their title, as that is what the lives are of migrant domestic workers and their employers. Together, the reports make clear that in absence of comprehensive integrated social care and welfare systems, migrant domestic workers play a critical role in supplementing the care needs of many households in Lebanon. The reports also confirm that migrant domestic workers face a range of vulnerabilities to exploitation. These include a lack of labor law protection, an unequal working relationship under a sponsorship mechanism where the employer has a level of control over the worker, high recruitment costs for both the worker and the employer, and limits in accessing social justice. Lebanon is not unique in facing challenges to ensure decent work for domestic workers. Many countries are searching for ways to offer enhanced protection. There is hope, though. Since the adoption of the ILO Domestic Workers Convention 5 years ago, 22 countries have ratified ILO Convention 189, and 30 countries have adopted legal reforms to extend protection to domestic workers. In Lebanon, the National Steering Committee on Migrant Domestic Workers, which is led by the Ministry of Labor, is looking for ways to address the exploitation challenges that migrant domestic workers face. That is much appreciated. I hope that the reports today, to be shared today, and the subsequent discussions will offer food for thought for ways forward to govern the care economy and to address the plight of migrant domestic workers, and thus assist the Lebanese authorities in meeting its objective of ensuring decent work for all. Today's meeting is part of the Work in Freedom program, which aims at reducing vulnerability to human trafficking and forced labor of women and girls from South Asia. Allow me to thank the United Kingdom's Department for International Development for their generous support to this very important program. I would also like to thank the European Union for their financial contribution to the report that we're launching today. Finally, I'd like to thank all of you for your participation and wish you fruitful deliberations. I'd like to end with 2 quotes. The first one is by a Swiss novelist, Max Frisch, who said, "We asked for workers, but we got human beings instead." The other quote is by the ILO's Director General on the occasion of the 5th anniversary of the adoption of the ILO Domestic Workers Convention, when he asked, "Who cares for the carers?" I thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you, Hans. That was a nice way of taking off in this day. But we'll move now to our second speaker, Ms. Jumana Haimour. Ms. Haimour is the head of the Labor Inspector Department at the Ministry of Labor here in Lebanon. And she is representing the ministry. And she's head of the Labor Inspectors and government representative at the Labor Arbitration Board. She's been at the Ministry of Labor for 20 years. Among her roles is to monitor and inspect recruitment agencies according to existing regulations. At the Institute here, we're always glad to have a representative from the government where we can really bring in a lot of our ideas and our policy options for them and dialogue those matters with them. We're aware of the complexities of policy making. We're not simplistic in thinking that governments will take any package and go and implement it because they have a lot of priorities on their table. But also, we want always to open those channels with them and discuss ways of reforming or innovating their policies. So I'll give you the floor, Ms. Haimour, and we'll be glad as well to stay with us to perhaps take some questions.
إن شاء الله. صباح الخير. أنا رح أختصر كتير رح يختصر وجودي اليوم على تمثيل معالي الوزير. رح أقول كلمة مختصرة عن حضوري وعن المشروع اللي عم تحضر له اليوم أو عن دراسة اللي عم تطلق اليوم. خليني أقول تعليق مش كلمة. موجودة في هذا اللقاء الذي تم تمويله والإعداد له وتنظيمه وتحديد المتكلمين بمن فيهم ممثلو الوزارة دون أن تعلم به أو يتم التنسيق معها ولو من باب اللياقة والبروتوكول. لا بل والغرابة أيضاً قرأنا اسم الوزارة على الدعوات دون استشارتها، ورغم ذلك أتينا كي لا يظن البعض أن التحضير لهذه الورشة قد تم برعاية أو بمعرفة وزارة العمل ودون أن تحضر، فلا علم لنا بهذه الورشة ولا خبر. أتينا لإبلاغكم أن لا علاقة للوزارة بما تقومون به بغض النظر عن تقييمنا للمبادرة، علما أن هذه المواضيع هي من صلاحية وزارة العمل بالتحديد. والموضوع الذي يبحث اليوم بالرغم من أهميته ليس من أولوية الوزارة أو الحكومة أو الشعب في هذه المرحلة المصيرية، حيث الكيان والوطن والدولة على كف عفريت وكذلك المؤسسات الدستورية. الأولوية هي اليوم للعمل على إنقاذ لبنان وإيجاد حل حقيقي للنازحين السوريين الذين بلغوا أكثر من 2 مليون على أرض الوطن. واسمحوا لنا أن نسأل: أليست إثارة المواضيع الجانبية الآن محاولة لتحويل الأنظار عن الأمور الأساسية في إطار الجو اللبناني والعربي والدولي العام ولمصلحة من؟ نحن نعلم أن مؤسسة عصام فارس العريقة لم تنشأ لبحث هذا الموضوع، وأن الجامعة الأمريكية كذلك لم تؤسس لبحثه. وإذا كان هدف مكتب منظمة العمل النضال لتوظيف النازحين وتأليف نقابة العاملات الأجنبيات في الخدمة المنزلية، فنحن لسنا بحاجة إلى هذه الأدوار. شكرا. أنا بدي أعتذر منكم.
خليكي معنا نخلص الأوبننج. Thank you Ms. Jumana. I understand your point. بشكرك على رأيك وبتصور
رأي شخصي، رأي رسمي.
رأي الرسمي. وهلأ إن شاء الله بركي خلال النهار بصير في يمكن توضيح أكثر على أهمية هذا البحث اللي صار.
ما شككنا بأهميته نحن، قلنا بغض النظر عن تقييمنا لأهميته.
عظيم. طيب. We move now to the third speaker today and this morning, Ms. Nicola De Lozio. She is the second secretary and the human rights focal point at the British Embassy in Beirut. She covers politics and human rights at the embassy. She's head of the communication teams covering all the British Embassy's media and digital work as well as public diplomacy. Nicola, it's glad to have you in our institute. I'll give you the floor.
Thank you. I was very pleased to be invited to speak today on behalf of the British Embassy, because this is an issue that we are proud to advocate for. Yes. And I'm particularly pleased to see the Ministry of Labour represented today, and we do hope that they will continue to take part in the rest of the session, because it's so important to have dialogue between government and civil society. I continue to be personally shocked every time I read the figures on migrant domestic workers in Lebanon. It is staggering to consider that 250,000 migrant women are working in homes across Lebanon. That's 250,000 women deserving fair treatment, who, as Mr. van der Glyn said, are carrying out a vital caregiving role. For many of us here today, the findings of the study are not news, but it is always striking to take note of the hard figures. 40% of workers are not being paid at the end of every month, like they are supposed to be. Half are not getting something as simple as a day off. 1 in 5 employers keep the worker locked inside, and 94% of employers wrongly hold on to passports. But what is important about this study is that it doesn't simply point fingers. It acknowledges that many employers simply don't know or don't understand the rules. And it sets out the responsibilities of recruitment agencies and the government to educate those employers, as well as outlining a role for civil society. As the British Embassy, we funded a study in 2015 by chevening scholar Lina Saifi. She specifically honed in on the relationship between employers, workers, and recruiters to understand what goes wrong from the day of the workers' arrival in Lebanon. She too found that trust and understanding are key factors in the treatment of migrant domestic workers. All this goes to say that we are not accusing Lebanese employers of being terrible people. There are undoubtedly employers and recruiters who knowingly abuse their workers. But there are also many others who will treat their workers better thanks to simple steps and education. Both this ILO report and Ms. Kasaifi's, entitled Equip, give practical suggestions on how to do so, and we very much hope that the Ministry of Labour will build on the recent positive actions it has taken, for example, against recruitment agencies, as well as continuing a dialogue with civil society. I also want to say a bit about the UK's global work in this field. I'm pleased to say that, as you've heard, this study was undertaken under the Work in Freedom programme. DFID, the Department for International Development, is providing almost $15 million from 2013 to 2018 to the ILO and the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine to help prevent the trafficking of women and girls from South Asia into the domestic and garment sectors, and to support women's economic empowerment by helping them to migrate safely to decent jobs. The programme targets specific known trafficking routes between South Asia and the Middle East, including Lebanon. Some of the results of this programme will include over 120,000 women, girls, and their families benefiting from outreach on how to make informed migration decisions, reducing their risk of being trafficked. Over 100 private sector recruitment agencies adopting ethical principles and practices, and 80,000 women and girls receiving pre-decision orientation to help them avoid trafficking and exploitation. And for the worst cases, more extreme perhaps than much of what we're talking about today, Prime Minister Theresa May recently announced over $40 million towards the battle against modern slavery to target trafficking routes and help victims. And we have strengthened our legislation too. Last year, almost 300 modern slavery offences were prosecuted in the UK under the Modern Slavery Act, the first legislation of its kind in Europe, which has delivered tough new penalties to put traffickers behind bars. And this is to say that we acknowledge the challenges of governments and that we all still have further steps to take, and it's an ongoing process for all of us. Finally, the Prime Minister is personally committed to the UK continuing to lead this fight on the global stage after we successfully incorporated the eradication of modern slavery into the Sustainable Development Goals, which will be a strong theme at the UN General Assembly today and this week. As for the embassy, we look forward to an ongoing discussion with civil society and the Lebanese government on this topic. Events like this one today are very important. On this issue, attitudes really do count. I'm sure you've all heard of our previous ambassador's job swap with an Ethiopian worker. A silly stunt, perhaps, but with a serious message. Some people may have thought twice about the way they were treating the person in their home. And the more we talk about this issue, the more people will have those second thoughts. We can help them to be better employers, and that's why discussions like today are so important. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicola. Thanks for Jumana and Hans. That was a great way of opening this workshop today. I think we have a short film, right? And then we will break, and after that, we'll take off again with Sausan's presentation of the findings of the report.
व्यवहार पनि आमाकै हातमा थियो आमाले कपी किताब सबै आमाले नै दिनुहुन्थ्यो त्यसरी नै मैले स्कुल लाइफ सिधै एसएलसीमा ब्याकग्राउन्ड लाग्यो मेरो ब्याकग्राउन्ड लागेपछि भैँसीलाई घाँस काट्ने यसो उस्तो गर्ने त्यतिकै नै आमा पनि 60 सालमा खस्नु भयो अनि बाहिर जाने मैले प्रोसेस चाले हैन भिनाजु एकजना हुनुहुन्थ्यो गिरी अनि भिनाजुलाई भने कि भिनाजु म पनि बाहिर जानु पर्यो के हुन्छ कि भन्ने थियो अनि भिनाजुले भने हुन्छ लेब्रान नै जाऊ यहाँबाट ब्याग स्याग भिनाजुले नै पार गरिदिनु भयो सिलगढीबाट एकचोटि स्टेनमा लगाएर दिल्ली लानुहुन्छ होला भन्ने सोचेको थिएँ तर दिदी घरमा एक दिन राख्नु भएन नक्सलबाट 5 बजे लिएर जानु भयो जक्सनमा 9 बजी रेलमा चढ्यौँ हामी चढ्यौँ रेलमा निन्द्रै लाग्दैन के हुन्छ भनेर मेरो त एकदमै पुरा सोचाइ मात्रै त्यही मात्रै आयो क्या बिनाजुले चाहिँ भन्नुभएको थियो कि 7 बजीको फ्लाइट दिल्लीबाट एकचोटि लेब्लान भोलिपल्ट 10 बजीको फ्लाइट 10 बजी पुर्याउँछ भन्नुभएको थियो तर 10 बजी नपुगेर हामीलाई चाहिँ दिल्लीबाट चाहिँ एकचोटि अबुधाबीमा जाँदै थियो अबुधाबीमा त एक दिन रेस्ट गर्नु पर्यो होइन त्यहाँबाट अनि अबुधाबीबाट चाहिँ लेब्लान पुर्याएपछि के भन्यो भने कि एयरपोर्ट पुगिसकेपछि पासपोर्ट माग्यो त्यहाँको एयरपोर्टको मान्छेले पासपोर्ट दिउँ हामीले त्यो पछि हामीलाई एउटा पुरा गोदाम जस्तै घरमा यत्तिकै हालिराखेको थियो क्या केटीहरू त नि भयभरको सबै ला मलाई त यहाँ त किन हाल्यो नि यत्रो मान्छे यस्तो हुँदैन थियो होला भन्ने पुरा सोचाइ भएर पुरा डर भयो कि मलाई त अनि भाषा पनि नबुझ्ने अब के बोलौँ तिनीहरूसँग अब बोल्नै हुँदैन आफ्नो आफ्नो साउ आउँदो रहेछ र पासपोर्ट दिएर चाहिँ आफ्नो साउ आएपछि अनि पासपोर्ट बोलायो सबैजना गइसके लास्टमा म एक्लै परेँ त्यति बेला मलाई त एकदमै डरै मात्रै लाग्यो के हुन्छ होला मलाई के गर्छ होला किन मलाई यति बेला पनि लिन आएन 9-10 घन्टा त वेटिङ भइसक्यो अनि 8 बजेको थियो अनि त्यो साउले भने कि लेट भयो भने लेट भयो धेरै टाइम भयो भने 9-10 घन्टा मैले वेटिङ गरेँ भने अनि उसले गाडीमा चढ भने गाडीमा मैले ब्याग सेक हालेँ गाडीमा अफिसमा लगाउँ अफिसमा लाँदाखेरि झमक्कै रात परेको 9 बजेको थियो अनि अफिसमा भने कि के काम गर्ने भनेको त्यो साउले म त जे घरमा काम गर्नु भनेको चाहिँ घरमा काम गर्न आएको भने अनि होइन घरमा काम गर्ने होइन एउटा बुढी मान्छे छ त्यो बुढीलाई चाहिँ हेर्नुपर्छ भन्नु अनि त्यसमा ओके मैले ओके भन्ने अनि लग्यो अनि घरमा लगेपछि त्यो एउटा श्रीलङ्की रहेछ त काम गर्ने के गर्नुपर्छ मैले भन्दाखेरि उयो बुढीलाई हेर्नुपर्छ तैँले पागल छ यस्तो छ भन्ने क्या त्यो श्रीलङ्की ओहो म त पागल अब के गरेर हिँड्ने त त्यतिखेर त म त यहाँ अब यो ठाउँमै म बस्दिनँ जस्तो लाग्यो क्या त्यो कसैले मलाई सहयोग गरेर नेपालसम्म पुर्याइदिए पनि म त त्यसकै काम गरिदिन्थेँ बरु त्यस्तो लागेको थियो उपाय भएन मैले कोसँग सोध्ने त कोसँग सहारा लिने होइन भन्नुहोस् त अनि त्यसरी नै भयो अनि भोलिपल्ट अनि बुढीलाई उठाएर नुहाइदिनु भनौँ अनि नुहाइदिनु भन्दाखेरि अब त्यो बुढीलाई भाषा बुझ्छु न उठाउनु सक्छु समस्या त पुरै भयो कि त्यति बेला चाहिँ म लेब्नानमा 4 वर्ष बस्दाखेरि कि त्यो बुढीले चाहिँ एक दिन खानेकुरा चाहिँ लगेर टोइलेटमा दुलोमै हाल्दैछ क्या दुलोमा हालिदिँदाखेरि उसको बुहारीले देखेछ मिरा यहाँ आमाले लगेर त खानेकुरा टोइलेटभित्र हाल्यो भन्यो अनि गएर यसो हेर्दा टोइलेटमा रहेछ अनि ग्लोभ्स लाउनु ग्लोभ्स लाएर झिक्नु भन्यो क्या ग्लोभ्स लाएर यसरी झिकेर यसरी न्युरिँदा बुढीले याद नि बक्सिङले थियो कि यस्तो त्यो दिन नै मेरो यो पागल बुढीलाई हेर्न मैले चाहिँ धेरै ठुलो भुल गरेछु यो मैले अहिलेसम्म यस्तो कुटै खाएको थिइनँ यो बुढीले मलाई यस्तो कुट्यो भने पुरा आँसु आयो क्या त्यति बेला चाहिँ दुःखै लाग्यो अर्काको हातको कुटै खानु नि होइन भन्नुहोस् त दुःखै लाग्यो त्यति बेला त्यही पनि ठिकै छ घर फ्यामिलीमा राम्रो थियो त्यो राम्रै गरिरहेको थियो फ्यामिलीमा खाना लाउनुको त्यो समस्या थिएन होइन 2 वर्ष बित्यो त म घर जान्छु भने यो आमा बित्छ त अनि जानु भन्थ्यो अब तेरो आमा कहिले बित्छ र म कहिले घर जानु होइन कहिले बिच्ने अब बुढीको त अझै होला आयो अनि त्यसरी नै उनीहरूले झुक्याएर क्या घरमा जान्छस् भने म टिकट गरिदिन्छु भने चाहिँ त्यसरी नै 4 वर्ष बितायो अनि मलाई पैसा कति 1.5 वर्षको थियो मैले थाप्नु पर्ने 1.5 वर्षको पैसा दियो उसले अनि उसको तर्फबाट $200 दिएको थियो ल तँ के सपिङ गर्छस् तँलाई जे किन्न मन लाग्छ त्यही दे अनि ब्याग स्यागले कपडा सपडाले अनि बेलुका कति 5 बजेको टिकट थियो अनि लगेर एयरपोर्टमा लगेर छोडिदिएँ म त्यसरी नेपाल आइपुगेँ पहिला 1 राउन्ड लाएँ मैले आफ्नो झोलासोला राखेर होइन अनि सबैलाई हेरेँ सबैलाई ठिकै थियो अब जाने नयाँ दिदी बहिनीहरूले चाहिँ मेन पहिलो कुरा चाहिँ भाषा सिकेपछि त्यहाँ ग्यास कसरी बाल्ने र वासिङ मेसिनमा कसरी कपडा धुने त्यो सिकेर नै पठाउनु राम्रो
So we'll break for, I think we're already late, but let's break for 15 minutes. and come back in 15 minutes, okay?
Good morning. My name is Rayan El Amin. I'm the Assistant Director here at the Issam Faris Institute. I want to welcome you back to this first session and to the meat and the research of the conference and research by Dr. Sausan Abdurrahim. So I wanted to just let you know, logistically, we'll have Dr. Abdurrahim do a presentation, then we'll have some discussants, two discussants, and I'll introduce them right before they speak. And then we're going to have the second part of this session where we're going to have the comparative findings by two more speakers, Igor Bosk and Zaina Mizher. So first of all, we'll start with an introduction for Sausan and a little bit about her research. She'll have about 20 minutes to speak. The discussant, 15 to 20 minutes. And then the discussants will have about 10 minutes, and then we'll go on to the second part. So Dr. Sausan Abdurrahim is Associate Professor at the Faculty of Health Sciences at AUB. She has a PhD in Health Behavior and Health Education. Her research interests include social inequalities, gender, aging, and health, and the health of refugees and low-income migrant workers. So we want to welcome her here to share with us the main findings of this report entitled Intertwined Study of Employers of Migrant Domestic Workers in Lebanon. So with that, please help me welcome Dr. Abdurrahim.
Thank you very much, Rayan. And thanks to the Issam Faris Institute and the International Labour Organization for organizing this event. I'm going to present some findings from the report from the study that we carried out in 2015. And I'm very happy to, I'm very honored to have discussants of the caliber of Nizar Saghiya and Dr. Charlotte Karam. So I hope that their interventions will highlight some of the, critically, some of the issues that the results from the report bring up. The study that the report is based on was actually a study of the attitudes, knowledge, and practices of Lebanese employers of migrant domestic workers. Later on in the session, Zaina Mizher will present the results of a study with the migrant domestic workers themselves. I've carried out another study in 2010 with CAFA on also the attitudes and perceptions of the employers. And it's really important to shift the lens sometimes from a focus on the experiences and the discourse from the migrant domestic workers themselves to understand the employers also and what drives basically one factor that drives the system of the hiring of migrant domestic workers in Lebanon. The study, of course, was funded by the International Labour Organization, and it was carried out by AUB, at AUB by myself. And I want to acknowledge Ms. Zainab Shirri, who is here in the audience, who was the main research assistant on the study and who carried out a lot of the organizing and with data collection. It's also important to acknowledge the role that CAFA played in the design and in the input that they've provided throughout the process, as well as the Anti-Slavery International, an international organization that also works in the area of gender migration, trafficking, and slavery. The study is mixed methods, and it's based on 29 in-depth interviews that we carried out with the employers of migrant domestic workers, the majority of whom the interviews were actually carried out with women. We only had a few interviews that we were able to do with men. And the quantitative part is basically a survey of 1,200 Lebanese employers who reside in Beirut, Saida, Junia, and Jbeil. I won't go into the methodology of the study. It's in the report, in the copy that you have in your folders. I want to start with two quotes here, just to sort of couch the study that we did, which in many ways focused on kafala, contract, practices, but I want to couch it in the context of today's conference or meeting on the care economy. The quote on your left is by a woman in her late 20s, early 30s, who's a mother and who works full-time. And basically, she is explaining the reasons why she hires a full-time live-in domestic worker. This is a woman who has a full-time job. She finishes her job at 5 p.m. and has young children. This is prototypical of a lot of women who receive education in Lebanon and who not only who receive education, but who need to work to support the family and need to hold on to jobs from 9 to 5 p.m. She states that she needs to hire a domestic worker because she cannot come home and start another shift of cooking and cleaning and taking care of the children. She needs to hire another woman to take care of these responsibilities, which in our culture and many other cultures are responsibilities of women in the family. The other quote on your left is by an elderly woman who actually was diagnosed with cancer and received treatment for cancer and is recovering, who lives alone in Ras Beirut because her children all live in the US and other parts of the world. And she indicated that she can take care of the cooking and some other responsibilities. However, she needs to have a domestic worker with her at night in case she needs to go to the bathroom or, she wants someone to be with her in order not to fall, just in case. This is prototypical, actually. A lot of the domestic workers in Lebanese families are hired to take care of children and to take care of older adults. Definitely, we've interviewed people, women who don't have young children, who indicated that they hire domestic workers because they don't like domestic work themselves, because they've always been used to having domestic workers at home when they were growing up. But the majority of people that we interviewed, the women hire domestic workers because they need to have an extra hand to help them take care of the gendered responsibilities in Lebanese families. And this graph shows that almost 1 in 5 employers hire domestic workers because they have young children, 1 out of 5 because there's an elderly person in the house, and 1 out of 5 because there's a person in the house who has an illness or a disability. These answers are not mutually exclusive because respondents could check more than one option. But definitely, at least a quarter of the families hire 1 out of 5 of the families hire domestic workers because they need someone to provide services to older adults or to someone with an illness or disability in old age. And the same thing for young children. So what are the characteristics of domestic workers who are hired by Lebanese families? I want to just clarify that all the data that we show, that I show in this presentation, are based on what the employers, based on answers by the employers themselves. They're not based on the domestic workers, of course. So, we need to take that into account, that maybe some figures are overestimated, underestimated, because it's the employer that's providing this information. But some of the data here on this table should not be biased because it's factual. We found out that the majority or largest proportion of domestic workers hired by Lebanese families are from Ethiopia. So this needs to be taken into account because Ethiopia actually has a ban on domestic workers. So however, women are coming and they are working in Lebanese families. The same thing for Sri Lanka. Following Ethiopia, the second highest number of migrant domestic workers comes from Bangladesh and then the Philippines. As would be expected, the majority of domestic workers are in their 20s. They are young women who come and spend a good number of years of their lives in their youth working in Lebanon and providing services to Lebanese families. Almost half of them are married back home. And their husbands or their children, if they have children, are not here with them. And in terms of the number of years working with Lebanese families, it's distributed almost equally, but almost 20% of, or 25% of migrant domestic workers have been working with Lebanese families for at least 4 years, even though the system is built around a domestic worker coming for 2 years. The contract is for 1 year, but the system is built around a short temporary period of stay in Lebanon, and basically the domestic worker would have to go back before she can come back to Lebanon again. But a large number of employers actually retain the same worker for a number of years, and women start to begin to spend more and more years working in Lebanon. So, as I mentioned earlier, the goal of the study actually focused a lot more on understanding how employers interact with the system of hiring migrant domestic workers in Lebanon, and their attitudes and knowledge of the system and their practices. The study focused on basically the kafala system, the standard contract that the Lebanese Ministry of Labor holds and expects the employers to sign. Also looked at the personal attitudes, values, and practices of the employers, with basically the implications that this have on the ability of migrant domestic workers to organize and to improve their social living conditions and their well-being. What I will focus on in the next few slides is basically just some of the results related to 4 factors that have direct impact on the well-being of the caregivers. So these individuals, these women are coming to Lebanon to provide care to Lebanese families, but what about their well-being themselves? And what are the factors related to their employment conditions that impact their well-being? I'll focus on the payment of salary, the issue of respecting the migrant domestic workers the right to a full day of rest, the issue of withholding the migrant domestic workers' passport, and then limiting the freedom of migrant domestic workers. Some of the numbers have actually been mentioned very quickly in the morning session, but I'll elaborate more on this. So in terms of the payment that migrant domestic workers receive for the care that they provide, I want to emphasize that in the standard contract, there is nothing there are 18 points in the standard contract that govern the relationship between the employer and the employee, and the employers are required to sign this contract. Sometimes the employers also sign another contract between themselves and the recruitment agency, and that's a different thing. But this is what everyone is required to sign and to abide by. There's nothing in the contract that sets a minimum wage for the salary of migrant domestic workers. However, there is a clause that clearly states that the domestic worker is supposed to receive her salary at the end of every month. So this is included in the standard contract. What we saw in the study is that the majority of migrant domestic workers receive between $150 to $200 a month in salary. Very few, very, very few receive less than $150 a month. This is reported again by the employers themselves. And also a small proportion receive $400 or more. But for the most part, the majority of these caregivers receive between $150 and $200 in salary a month. I'm not talking at all about recruitment agencies today. I will talk about that in an event actually organized by ILO tomorrow. A large amount of the money that the employers pay go to the recruitment agencies. However, when it comes to the salary of the domestic worker, then these are the numbers that the domestic workers receive. What we saw also is that, yes, 60% of the employers abide by the clause in the contract and pay the domestic worker her salary at the end of the month. But there's a good chunk, 40%, who do not do this, who do not pay the salary at the end of the month. Sometimes, in qualitative interviews, the employers would say, well, she doesn't ask for the salary, or I save the salary for her and I give it to her every 6 months. Or she sends money to her brother and who wastes her money, so I'm trying to protect her. But there are also some employers who would only pay the salary at the end of the contract. So withhold the salary that they are required to pay to the worker until the end, justifying that they are paying for the workers' food and lodging and other expenses. This, of course, is in direct violation of the Lebanese standard contract, which which has the minimum requirements for in terms of labor rights. The salary depends to a large extent, the salary of the domestic worker depends to a large extent on the socioeconomic standing of the family itself. So this is really, it's really interesting. I think people know this, but the numbers here will, provide some empirical evidence that there's sort of like a sliding scale of everybody in Lebanon can hire a domestic worker and can pay whatever they can pay according to their income, it seems. So households that make less than $1,000 a month a larger proportion of these households pay a low salary of less than $200. However, as the income of the family increases, then the family starts to pay a higher salary for the domestic worker. So again, this goes back to the point that there is no minimum standards or minimum wages that the domestic workers are expected to receive. They basically receive whatever the family can afford. If the family can afford more, they get a higher salary. The salary is also affected by the nationality of the domestic worker, and this deserves a lot of analysis in terms of thinking about racialization, thinking about skills, and other factors that influence this. But at this slide, you see that 65% of Filipina migrant domestic workers receive a salary of $300 or more, whereas for workers from Bangladesh, 72% of them receive a salary of less than $200. So the salary scale is very much influenced by the origin, by the perceived race and skills of the domestic workers. The salary also remains, for the most part, stagnant, does not increase for the first 3 or 4 years of employment. The salary doesn't increase. So a very small proportion of migrant domestic workers who have been hired by a family for less than 3 years receive a high salary. Then, you see a sharp increase for domestic workers who have been working for a family for more than 5 years. These are all important to take into account because they definitely influence the well-being of domestic workers in terms of the salary that they're able to accumulate. The whole point of them coming to Lebanon is to basically send back remittances to their families back home, whether children or extended family and parents. And if you look at these numbers, it shows that actually a large proportion of domestic workers are not able to do this, are not able to send the remittances that can actually lift their families back home out of poverty. In terms of the number of hours of work, there is a clause in the standard contract that clearly states that a domestic worker is expected to work 12 hours a day and not more in the contract. Of course, the labor laws in many countries state that the workday is 8 hours a day. But the standard contract basically is flexible or is generous for the employers and allows them to ask someone to work up to 12 hours a day. And the majority of domestic workers actually work between 8 and 10 hours a day. So if you look at this, you think, okay, it's not bad, especially in the qualitative interviews. Employers were saying, well, the domestic worker doesn't work the 10 hours. She works in the morning, and then she can rest, and then she works when the kids come home from school, and then in the evening. So she's really working the whole day, more than 12 hours, but in terms of number of hours, she gets rests. However, if you look at the number of days that the domestic workers, and this is again based on reports by the employers, only 42% of the workers, spend working 6 days or less, And more than 50% work 7 hours a week. They don't get a day off. In terms of, there is a clear clause in the standard contract that the worker has to get a full day of rest. There's nothing in the contract that states whether the worker is allowed to leave the house on her day of rest, or the family can actually keep her with them and not allow her to go out. Oh, it's number, okay, I'm not sure why this happened. But the half of the pie, the lower half of the pie shows that 50% of employers actually do not give their worker a full day of rest. Based on their reports, they don't give the worker Sunday off or any other day. 1/4 gives the worker a day of rest, but does not allow her to go out on her own. The employers would state, yes, she doesn't have to cook and clean, but she has to be with me. If I go shopping, she comes shopping with me. If I take the kids to the park, she comes with me, but she's not home cooking and cleaning. And only 1/4 of the employers actually give the worker a full day of rest and give her the right to do whatever she wants, go out with her friends or go to the mall. Granting the worker a full day of rest depends to a large extent on also the nationality of the migrant domestic worker. I'm not sure what the explanation for this is. Maybe, with Filipino workers, they've been in Lebanon for a longer period of time. There's more of a stronger social network, so there's the ability to request or ask the employer to take a full day of rest. On the other hand, with workers from Bangladesh, a small 36% of them actually get a full day of rest. Withholding the migrant domestic workers' passport was mentioned earlier in the morning, and this is a very important labor condition. The ILO Convention 189 explicitly states that employers cannot retain the identification documents of the workers, of the domestic workers they hire. That the domestic worker should keep possession of her own passport and other documents. However, in Lebanon, there is this universal understanding that the employer keeps the domestic workers. I'll show you the number now. Withholds the worker's passport. And employers provided a range of explanations for this. Some employers actually said, I keep the passport, but it's the same way I keep my children's passport. I don't give my child his passport because what if it gets lost or damaged? In the same manner, I keep the domestic worker's passport with me. Some said that if the domestic worker asks for her passport, I'll give it back to her. And others said, no, I will not give her her passport because what does she need it for? But a good proportion of employers actually held the view that the passport is really the only thing that protects the employer from the worker escaping, and which has the ramification of the employer losing the money that they put up front to the recruitment agent, not to the domestic worker. So there's a strange logic that is going on here. However, it's basically, at least from the point of view of the employers, this is an action or a practice that they engage in order to protect themselves, and not because they want to harm the domestic worker or limit her freedom. So in this quote, and this is prototypical, it came out in many of the qualitative interviews that we carried out, but that in the context of Lebanon, where there are, and I wish that the Minister of Labor representative was here to see what the employers of domestic workers actually, how they see the system. But the idea is that in a context where there are no protections for Lebanese employers, so we are also very interested in protecting Lebanese employers and not only harming them and not harming them. But under the current conditions where the Ministry of Labor is not doing its job, basically, keeping the passport is what the only thing that the employer has. because they want to protect themselves from losing the money that they paid upfront to the recruitment agencies. Still, and many employers actually stated this, that no matter what you do, if a worker is not happy and she wants to leave the job, she will leave anyways. She'll just be more vulnerable without her passport. Yet, the employers still do this. 94% of the employers that we've interviewed withhold the migrant domestic workers' passport. So this is a really, this practice is universal. And it's really one of the things that, from a policy perspective, that needs to be a priority, that the majority of employers are withholding the passport, something that is seen from a perspective of international labor standards to violate the rights of the workers. And almost everyone does it. The last thing I want to mention, and I'll wrap up after this slide, is the other stark violation of the freedom of migrant domestic workers related to locking them inside the house. And this is, I just want to mention this because this is a common discourse in Lebanon, about employers who lock the worker inside. And there's actually, in the qualitative interviews that we carried out, there's a generally strong feeling against doing something like this. In some cases, because it violates the human rights and the freedom of the worker. But in other cases, the explanation is that, well, what if a fire broke? What if something bad happens inside the apartment and my kids are inside? I want her to be able to open the door and leave in these cases. But actually, locking the worker inside the house was widely practiced, unlike withholding the passport. So even though we thought that everybody locks the domestic worker inside and doesn't allow her to leave, almost 25% only lock the worker inside the house. A good chunk, 43%, of the employers stated that they give the worker a key to the house. So the question about whether she's locked in or not is not relevant because she has a key, she can open the door and leave any time. 34% do not give the worker a key to the house, but do not lock her inside. But the rest, there's 25% who actually engage in this practice. So I want to end here, although I had a couple of other slides, but I want to thank everyone, and I look forward to, I will not talk about policy recommendations because that's the work of others in this room. So thank you, and I look forward to the feedback from.
Thank you, Sausan. We're going to have two discussants now respond to the presentation. We have Dr. Charlotte Karam, who's the Associate Professor of Organizational Psychology here at AUB. Her research is in cross-cultural organizational behavior and management, and is a multidisciplinary perspective that broadly examines responsible engagement within the Arab world. So we'll have Dr. Karam respond, and we'll also have Nizar Saghiye also come up here, if you don't mind, and be the other discussant and have an intervention on the presentation. Nizar Saghiye is a lawyer, activist, and founder of Legal Agenda, Al-Mufakkira Al-Qanuniyya, which is a non-governmental, non-profit organization based in Beirut. Legal Agenda focuses primarily on matters related to marginalized groups in society, including migrants, refugees, prisoners, women, homosexuals, disabled, and is advocating for the basic rights of all these groups. So with that, what I'm going to do is maybe start with you, Dr. Karam, 10 minutes for an intervention, and then we'll move over to Mr. Saghiye.
Great. Thank you very much, Sausan, for a wonderful talk, and thank you all for being here today. I'd like to, I am an organizational psychologist, but I approach this very much from a business school perspective. I am the Associate Dean of Programs at the Olean School of Business. And I think that is really the hat I want to wear today, both as closer to the employer perspective, but secondly, from an education of future business leaders within Lebanon and the region. And I think from hearing this morning's talk, and then again from reading very closely Sausan's report, often the employer or the space of thinking about employers within the conversation of domestic migrant workers, within the care economy, is often left off the table or not invited to the table, which is quite ironic when we talk about power dimensions within the space of the ILO and within the space of much discussions around this. We often think about neoliberal market economics. We often think about employers being, and often they are, the source of much of the problem, but I think that have to be now part of the discussion of solutions, particular local solutions within Lebanon, where government interventions are often not serving the purpose that we hope that they would. So with that, as a starting point, I would like to talk a little bit about the idea of employer mobilization. And I realize that the wonderful interviews and a lot of the discussion and quotes included in Sausan's presentation bring a strong voice of employers, and these employers being single families and often single women who run the household. And I think that there is a case to be made that it's very difficult to mobilize single employers when we're talking about individual households, and that there might be a stronger case to be made about the mobilization of larger employers, like in the SMEs, small to medium-sized enterprises, and larger employers within Lebanon more broadly. And I think that's where I want to focus my couple of minutes that I have, thinking about the employer being part of the organization in a more formal role in private sector. I think that within Lebanon there is a strong role that private sector can play in moving forward or partnering with or even beginning to discuss some of the very important issues that we have here when looking at the lives of these individuals within the household. And one clear area we see happening in private sector in Lebanon and from the larger employers, and what I mean by larger employers is, they employ 200 to 300 employees or up to 1,000. This engagement around responsible business practices. So you have within private sector companies coming together, very much interested in this, sexy new term, corporate social responsibility. How can we use corporate social responsibility within, towards development agendas? And I'm happy to say that the AUB and the Orleans School of Business has been leading two initiatives that I think are very, very much relevant to the discussion. One, which is the signatory to the Global Compact, the UN Global Compact Network. And although in 2016, the conversation has been around disability and engaging, trying to push forward policies around disability, I believe that, speaking from much of what's come out of the report, that engaging with Global Compact within the context of Lebanon around domestic workers is a very strong and important area that we should consider perhaps for 2017. Another key area is bringing these stories outlined, these statistics that perhaps for people outside of you and I, who are familiar and have read reports like this over the last generations, is bringing it into the classroom. I wonder about responsible employer, or bringing employer perspectives and domestic workers' perspective into the business school classroom or into the classrooms that are not held in Issam Ferris Hall or in FAS. How can we begin to create a conversation of individual stories within the classroom? And I'd like to also, it sounds like I'm plugging so much, but another plug is that the AUB is one of the first signatories in the region for the prime responsible business practices within management education. And I think that these are principles that we as an institution commit to bringing within management education of our undergraduate students, graduate students, as well as executives across the region. I think that here, here's a second area where we can begin to look and bring in, these reports, bring in speakers like Sausan into the classroom to start to bring this forward and build this awareness campaign. And here I want to sort of end, around some of the recommendations. I know that you didn't go into them in your presentation. However, in your report, you outline very clear recommendations that I believe that partnering with private sector can help quite a bit, such as disseminating clearer information to the employer about employer responsibilities around domestic workers, awareness campaigns, as well as mechanisms for dispelling the misconceptions that you did actually go into today. As a final note, I think at best, these partnerships with private sector can be trailblazing within a context, I would venture to say, of a failed state where government is not stepping in to set the standards or to enforce the standards as recommended. So trailblazing there, or at very least, shaping the steps of half the converted, of those employers or employer organizations who are ready and open to at least a little bit participate in more responsible business practices. So thank you.
طيب فيني احكي بالعربي ولا؟ طيب اوكي. اوكي اللي بشوف الريبورت وبعدين بشوف الريكومنديشنز، هي اول ملاحظه، بحس انه مش نفس الشخص اللي عملهم، والنتائج اللي وصلنا لها ما بتوصل لهيك ريكومنديشنز. فهي ملاحظه اولى. فسمعت قبل شوي الدكتوره سوسن عم تقول انه هي ما اشتغلت على الريكومنديشنز، فهلا وصل لي الشرح للموضوع يعني. بس بس
ما حكيت عليهم.
اوكي، التعليق تبعي رح يكون على الريبورت يلي هو كتير مهم وأداة كتير مهمة، وبعدين علق على الريكومنديشنز يلي حقيقة في عندي إشكالية كتير كبيرة مع التوصيات المنعطى. بحس هيك ريبورت بهالأهمية مش ممكن ينتهي بهيك ريكومنديشنز. أول شيء بخصوص الريبورت، من الأسئلة يلي يعني رح أول شيء يعني كان مهم كتير يكون في ريبورت سيرفي معمول على الامبلويرز وحده سيرفي على الامبلويز حتى نسمع الطرفين، لأنه أكيد من الأسئلة اللي انطرحت على الامبلويرز في كتير جوابات ما كانت صحيحة. يلي واحد مثل ما ذكر بالريبورت أنه أكيد الواحد ما رح يقول كل شيء، يعني إذا هو ما عم بيدفع بدل الأجار ما حيجي يقول أنا ما عم بدفع بدل بسهولة، ربما هو بيشرحها بطريقة بتناسبه أكتر. فطبيعي الأرقام يلي وصلنا لها يلي هي كتير مهمة هي أقل من الحقيقة. وأنا بتوقع يعني مثلا إذا وصلنا ل 60% عم بيدفعوا كل شهر، ربما الحقيقة تكون أقل من هيك، وربما تكون 40 أو 30%. مشان هيك كان ممكن إذا شفنا الاثنين ريبورت مع بعض يكون في نظرة موضوعية أكتر للموضوع. فبتصور في نشاط أنه عم بينعمل لسيرفي تاني، بس يا ريت كان حينعرض بعد هيدا. عظيم، ممتاز. الشغلة الثانية اللي بدي أقولها أنه بعض الأسئلة ما انطرحت وهي مهمة، بمعنى أنه ناخد أجوبة عليها. من هالأسئلة مثلا من هيدول الامبلويرز، مين صار عنده مشاكل مع امبلويي سابق؟ يمكن انطرحت بس ما تناقشت. بس مين عاش تجربة أنه الامبلويي تركوا أو ترك البيت؟ وشوي بعطي شوية تحفظ على فكرة على كلمة run away، يعني بتمنى ما تنذكر بالريبورت النهائي، لأنه بتأشر لفرار يلي بيستعمل حتى من القضاة اليوم، يلي بيأشر على كأنه واحد هربان من محل كان معتقل فيه. من الأسئلة الثانية اللي ما انطرحت هي عند كاتب العدل، شو بيصير؟ كيف بيصير العقد يلي عم يتوقع؟ لأنه المعلومات يلي عنا المتوفرة يلي أكيد هي بتقول أنه كاتب العدل بينصحهم دايما أن يحطوا بدل أقل من الحقيقة لحتى يدفعوا رسم أقل، وبالتالي هيدي البراكتس بتخلي العامل يكون مجرد من أي حماية. لأنه مجرد صار البدل تبعه أقل، فإذا ما اندفع له البدل ما بيقدر يطالب بالبدل العالي تبعه. فهون كان كتير مهم نعرف كيف العلاقة عم تكون مع كاتب العدل، شو بيقول لهم كاتب العدل، كيف بيحكي وقتها بتصير هيدي العملية، وشو هل يا ترى بينحط البدل الحقيقي جوات الكونتراكت. من الأسئلة الثانية كمان يلي كان ضروري تنعمل هي هل يا ترى بينعمل one contract ولا many contracts، لأنه نحن بنعرف أنه كمان ببعض السفارات بيجبروهم يعملوا كونتراكت تاني، وأحيانا بيكون في تناقض بين الكونترايين بين الاثنين، وبالتالي بنوصل لمحلات كمان بيكون في مشكلة وتناقض وعدم حماية، وهيدا بدل يعني إذا بدل على شيء، وهيدا رح أوصل أنه الكونتراكت بالنهاية هو مش للحماية، الكونتراكت مش مثل منه موجود ومثل منه معمول فيه، هو just a formality to be، بس هو قليل تيحمي صاحب العاملة بالواقع، وبشرح أكتر بعدين ليش. مشان هيك كانت كمان فكرة الكونتراكت ووجود الكونتراكت كان لازم يكون في معالجة أفضل، وخاصة العامل لأي درجة هو عنده رأي لما عم ينعمل كونتراكت عند كاتب العدل. هل يا ترى بيكون ساكت قاعد على جنب، هل هو عنده عم بيلعب دور كمان هو جاي ليوقع كونتراكت قدام كاتب العدل، فبالتالي هو بارتي لهيدا الكونتراكت وبحق له يناقش وبحق له يحكي ويسأل عن ولا بس بتصير العلاقة بين كاتب العدل وصاحب العمل. فهدول بعض الأسئلة، أكيد في أشياء تانية ولكن هدول الأهم يلي كنت حابب يكون في إجابات عليهم بالريبورت وما كان في إجابات. هلأ كمان ما في إجابات على هل يا ترى في ديماند، يعني مثلا بينقال انه بس 25% مثل ما ظاهر من الدراسة عم بيسمحوا لهم انهم يخرجوا خارج البيت لحالهم بيوم العطلة. هل في ديماند؟ قديش الديماند؟ هل هالديماند عم تنقبل ما عم تنقبل؟ هيدا كتير مهم انه كمان نعرفه لنشوف العلاقة جوات البيت كيف، هل في نيغوشيشن بالموضوع. كل هيدي العلاقة يلي هي الديناميك بين الامبلوير والامبلويي بالمطالبة بحقوقه عمليا ما فيها اي مؤشرات بالكونتراكت. بعرف كان صعب يمكن تنعمل بالسيرفي، ولكن كان مهم يمكن تنعمل بالكواليتاتيف الابروش، وانه نعرف شوي هيدي الديناميك تنرسم نتفه. هل في مفاوضة، اي درجة من المفاوضة، ولا الامر مبتوت ومحسوم دايما واللي بحدد الاشياء دايما هو الامبلوير. كان في اشياء كمان مهمة كتير نعرفها عن المعتقد الديني تبع هل يا ترى عم بينسمح لها انها تمارس شعائر دينية جوات البيت، يكون في عندها شيء بالكونفكشنز تبعولها تقدر تعبر عنهم، ربما تحط اشياء بتدل على معتقدها بترتاح فيها او الى اخره. فمن هدول برجع بقول من الاسئله يلي ما شفتهم بالكونتراكت، بس الاسئله اللي شفتهم بالريبورت واللي انعطى عليهم جواب وهن كتير مهمين حقيقه، وكاكتيفيست كناس عم نشتغل بهيدا الفيلد، هيدا سلاح حقيقي بايدينا اليوم، هيدا الريبورت. في سبع أو 8 إجابات خطيرة جدا رح كررهم لأهميتهم، وبرجع بقول هي الأرقام المحطوطة هي حتما أقل من الواقع، لأنه الإمبلوير هو الوحيد يلي عم يحكي بهذا المحل. 40% ما عم بيدفعوا كل شهر، هيدا لحاله مخيف الرقم، خاصة أنه عم نحكي عن بروفيجن واضحة بالكونتراكت مثل ما قالت الباحثة، ومع ذلك ما عم يدفعوا لهم كل شهر. فيها قسم منهم ما بيدفع للآخر، فتخيلوا يعني حدا يحط حاله بس محل امبلويي، تركي بلدها، تركي كل شيء، عم تعيش بهيدا المحل، ما عندها ولا كلمة، ما عندها أي حياة خاصة، بس كمان الشيء اللي اجت البيربس تبع مجيئها وتحملها كل هيدا الأمور ما عم يوصل لها غير لآخر لحظة. يعني بيضل رغم كل القوة تبع النظام الكفالة المحطوط على رقبتها، في قوة انه بعد لهلا ما اخذت الفلوس، فبدها تراعي وتراعي وتراعي الامبلوير لحتى يضل في امكانية انه تحصل شيء بالاخر. فهيدا مخيف هيدا الوضع. الرقم الثاني المخيف هو اللي بيقفلوا الباب عليها 23%. يعني نحكى انه نحن مزبوط، يعني التوقعات كانت اكثر من هيك ربما بس كمان برجع بقول يمكن هيدا ما يكون مماثل للحقيقة، بس بيضله مخيف لأنه بيصور الشيء اللي دايما عم نقوله أنه العلاقة مع هدول الدوميستيك وركرز عم تقرب للسليفري. فلما بينقفل الباب هو نحن عم ينعطى إليمنت إضافي تنقول حقيقة هون في علاقة قريبة كتير لهيدا المحل وخطرة. الأمر الثالث هو أنه الرواتب متدنية جدا، يعني أكثر من 38% تحت $200، أكثر من 80% أقل من $300. فنحن عم نحكي عن ظروف العمل يلي هيدي كلها مقابل بدل هالقد واطي وفي يندفع ولا ما يندفع. فعم نشوف كيف عم تركب القصة. يعني بالريبورت ويمكن ما نذكر هلا قبل شوي محطوط انه almost all employers ما بيعترفوا بشيء اسمه حياة خاصة لهذا الشخص او اي قدرة انه يكون عنده حياة عاطفية. فمعناتها الامبلويرز معتبرين انه هيدا الشخص جاي كرمالنا، جاي لنا. وبينقال بالريبورت انه completely devoted للشغل يلي جاي كرماله. وهيدا بذكرنا بالتعميم يلي كان صادر عن الأمن العام ويلي طلب من الامبلويرز أنهم يراقبوا الحياة الخاصة تبعهم ويعلموه بأي طارئ جديد، ويلي كان للمفكرة ولكفى ولكتير كتير منظمات الموجودة هون الفضل أنه قدرنا نلغيه ونتراجع عنه. بس كان حلو نعرف هيدي الديناميك إذا صار شيء عند كاتب العدل بهيدا الموضوع كمان. خامس رقم خطير يلي بينسمح لهم أنهم يخرجوا برات البيت ما بيتعدوا 25%. وهيدا كمان يعني ما بعرف محطوط بالريبورت هون في تناقض بيحفزنا وبيعمل تشالنج أنه نقدر نفكر أكتر كيف أنه ما بينسمح لهم يخرجوا غير 25% بيوم العطلة، بس عندهم 47% منهم عندهم مفتاح البيت. ربما عندهم مفتاح البيت بس ينزلوا على الدكان ويطلعوا يشتروا غراض وكذا. فبس انه فهون عدم السماح للخروج يمكن هو عدم السماح انه يكون عندهم حياة خاصة اكثر ما انه مرتبط بالخوف انهم يهربوا او انهم يتركوا البيت. لانه اذا كان قصة خوف انه يتركوا البيت او خوف على الاستثمار يلي عمله الامبلوير، ساعتها ما لازم يعطيهم مفتاح البيت أصلاً وما يكون في 47%، وحتى يروح على الدكان ما لازم ينسمح لهم. ولكن إذا كان في فرق بين هيدول الرقمين معناتها هو الفرق أنه ما بدنا إياهم يعملوا شبكة علاقات خاصة، يكونوا معارف، يعيشوا حياتهم. هيدا كله مرفوض. هيدا بدل أكتر وأكتر على التأييد الحرية الشخصية، وبيقلل من أنه حقيقة الإمبلوير الهدف الأساسي تبعهم هو حماية استثماراتهم، وبيخليه يكون في يعني انتباه أكتر لهيدا الرقم. الرقم السادس الخطير كتير يلي بيعملوا أكتر من 12 ساعة، أكتر من 6 أيام، يعني بيشتغلوا 7 أيام هن 57%، يلي بيشتغلوا أكتر من 8 ساعات 63%. فإذا بنجمع الاثنين يعني 8 ساعات على 7 أيام يعني صرنا بالحوالي 49 ساعة أكتر. 8 ضرب 7 يعني 56 ساعة. فهيدا الشيء عم بيتعدى كل المعايير الدولية. فنحن بنرجع يعني بنشوف كل هيدول الكونديشنز اللي حكيت عنهم مع بدل كتير متدني وتقييد للحرية الخاصة. الباسبورت 94% بيحتفظوا بالباسبورت. تمييز عنصري واضح طالما الفيز بيتحددوا حسب الجنسية تبع الواحد مش حسب طاقاته ولا حسب السكيلز تبعه. فنحن قدام شرح وافي وكافي قدام أي قاضي أنه نحن عم نحكي هون عن شيء بيشبه كتير الفورست ليبر على القليل لقسم كبير من الإمبلويز. هيدا اللي بوصل لهيدا الوصف. فهيدا الدوكيمنت يستعمل كسلاح لإثبات أنه الفورس ليبر ماشي بلبنان، وبيستعمل كسلاح يتقدم للنيابة العامة تتحرك. مشان هيك أول ريكومنديشن كنت منتظرة أنه يلا يا بروسيكيوتر تحرك، الهيومن ترافيك موجود بلبنان. بينما لحديت هلأ رغم صدور القانون من 2011 لليوم 5 سنوات ما في ولا دعوة لها علاقة بدوميستيك ووركر حسب علمي بالفورس ليبر. فمعناتها النيابة العامة غايبة عن اللي عم بيصير بالحقيقة، انه الواقع بمحل، النيابة العامة بمحل تاني. فهيدي الدراسة اجت ردمت هيدي الهوة، وبتمنى نحن كمنظمات حقوقية موجودين اليوم نعرف نستعمل هالدراسة بهيدا الاتجاه. بالنسبة للريكومنديشن بدي احكي كلمتين وبرجع بقول يعني مثل ما عرفت انه الريكومنديشن انعملت بوقت تاني، بس انا برجع بقول الريكومنديشنز ما لهم علاقة بالدراسة، كتير بعاد عن الدراسة وجو الدراسة. اول شيء الفكرة نعم ما راح ابقى معكم اذا بتحب اسكت يعني. لما بينقال انه بدنا بالدراسه واضحه انه في قسم كبير من الحقوق يلي عارفين الامبلويرز انه حقوق للعمال، بس مع ذلك بيسمحوا لحالهم ينتهكوها. طيب اذا هيدا الوضع معناتها المشكله مش بمشكله توعيه الامبلويرز، الامبلويرز واعيين، مشكله انه يكون في مورال ديسكورس ضد هيدي التصرفات. ليه عم تعملوا هيك؟ فكيف بيجي الريكومنديشن address employers lack of knowledge of their rights؟ انه شوي غريبه هيدي تطلع بريبورت ثبت انه الاشياء الاكثر شيء واضحه وثابته واللي هي اساس العقد يلي هي دفع البدل كل شهر ما عم تنعمل. اكثر شيء ثابته هيدي وممكن حدا يقول ما بعرفها، واضحه بالعقد وبكل شيء ومع ذلك ما عم تتنفذ من قسم كبير منهم. فشو دخل التوعيه تبع الامبلويرز؟ امبلوير واعي كتير منيح انه هو البطل، هو القوي، هو القادر انه يحسم كل شيء بدون ما يكون في اي محاسبه واي مراقبه، وبالتالي مشكلته كيف بدي احط عليه محاسبه ومراقبه، مش كيف بدي اعرفه على حقوقه. نوصل لهيدي الريكومنديشن وتكون ريكومنديشن نمبر 1 انا برايي ما بتليق بالمنظمات اللي حطوها. أكثر من هيك أنه السبونسر سيستم يكون في شرح له تو ديميستيفاي السبونسر سيستم. شو ديميستيفاي؟ ما معروف شو سبونسر سيستم لو عم بيوصل لهيومن ترافيكينج، وهيدا واضح أنه سبونسر سيستم ما بيسمح بأنه ما تطلع برات البيت أو ما بيسمح أنه تعطي الباسبور، بس السبونسر سيستم بيمنعها تكون في عندها ريل أكسس تو جاستس، وهيدي المشكلة الأساسية. وإذا بدكم فينا نشرح ليش بالتفاصيل، وبتصور شرحناهم وحتى بدراسة تمت مع ILO على الأحكام يلي عملناها وتبرهن فعلا أنه كيف السبونسر سيستم بيؤدي دايما لمنع الأكسس تو جاستس يلي هو بيؤدي لمنع أي محاسبة للإمبلويرز بالانتهاكات يلي عم يعملوها. وأصلا مين بده يشرح السبونسر؟ جماعة وزارة العمل؟ مين؟ أي شيء غير القانون وبدنا نرجع على المبادئ العامة في طريقتين لقراءته. في الطريقة يلي هي معتمدة الهيومن رايت ويلي بدها تطحش وتفسر القوانين بالهيومن رايت، وفي الطريقة الثانية اللي بتجرب دايما تتحفظ وتعمل قد ما فيها لحتى تشد فمش غريب مثلا انه الكونتراكت ما في بقلبه انه يطلعوا لبرا بكل بساطة، لانه ما خلون يحطوا انه بحق لا تطلع لبرا، لانه كان في ناس من هيئه الاستشارات والتشريع بوزاره العدل عطوا استشاره انه ما لازم تطلع لبرا، لانه اذا طلعت لبرا ممكن تلقط امراض وترجع على البيت وتنقلها للعائله. بقضاة بهيئه الاستشارات والتشريع، وراحت الاستشاره وموجوده عند بوزاره العدل. فكيف بدنا نخلي public institutions تعطي نصائح بهالمحل؟ هيدا موضوع جدل، موضوع نقاش كبير، وبده يصير في عليه معارك وبده يصير في عليه تقاضي استراتيجي وبده يصير في عليه لحتى نقدر نحسن الوضع، مثل ما حصل بموضوع الباسبور لما طلع الحكم وقال بصريح العبارة هيدا تمييز عنصري وهيدي مساس بالحريات الأساسية وبالتالي خلصنا. أنا برأيي recommendation 1 is not valid. Recommendation 10 reinforce the role of governmental institutions in managing the recruitment and placement of migrant domestic. عظيم. الفكرة أنه نخفف الفيز تبع الجاية. أوكي عظيم. بس هون المشكل أنه قلنا أكثر فئتين عم بيجوا هن من أثيوبيا والفلبين حسب الدراسة، وبنغلاديش بتجي الثالث أو تاني أو ثالث. أوكي. فإذا كان في بلدين فيهم بان والإيجنسيز عم بياخدوا فلوس أكتر على أساس في بان، شو عملت الدولة اللبنانية لترفع هيدا البان؟ وليش ما في ريكومنديشن بهيدا الموضوع؟ وأنا بذكر وقتها انعمل مثل معاهدة بين فلبين ولبنان، لم يبتها لبنان ولكن كان وافق عليها الوزير، ومثل ما عرفنا أنه الفلبين وافقت عليها ولكن لبنان لحديت اليوم لم يصدق على هيدي المعاهدة، وكان هيدي المعاهدة هي الطريق لرفع البان. طيب رفع البان هو المهم لحتى أقدر خفف أو شيل الذرائع لتكتير هيدي المصاري، علما أنه هيدي الريكومنديشن عم تنعطى لحتى ينقال أنه لأنه في خايف على الانفستمنت تبعه وكذا. أول شيء لازم نعرف أنه ما لازم مبدئيا كل العائلات تقدر تجيب ناس، لازم التاكس تنرفع بهذا المحل، وهذا كمان كتير من ريكومنديشن خفف عدد الجايين على لبنان. مش معقول كل شخص يعتبر أنه عنده حق يكون عنده عاملة بالبيت، ما في ولا دولة بالعالم معترفة بهالحق، وعلى علمي ما في ولا وثيقة حقوق إنسان فوتت أنه الحق بأنه واحد يكون عنده عاملة. فطبيعي إذا الواحد ما عنده إمكانيات مالية كافية ما يكون عنده عاملة، وبالتالي ما يعتبر أنه هيدا استثمار. شو هو هالاستثمار تبع 2000 أو 3000 دولار يلي بيسمح لنا أنه نرهن حياة شخص ونحطه تحت رحمتنا كل الوقت؟ علما أنه الدراسة بيّنت أنه الموضوع مش بس استثمار مثل ما قلت قبل شوي بالفرق بين الخروج لبرا وملكية المفتاح تبع البيت. ريكومنديشن ثالثة يلي هي أنه نعطي incentives للإمبلويرز. يعني برجع بقول المشكل مش عند الامبلويرز عنده كل السلطة، هو السلطان، هو اللي عنده النتورك، هو اللي عنده المال، هو اللي عنده العلاقات، هو اللي عنده سيادة هو اللي عنده الامتيازات الكفيل، بينما هيداك ما عنده شيء، حتى قانون العمل ما بيحميه، ما عنده أي حماية. بس أنا جاي اليوم حتى أعطي كمان awareness incentive للامبلويرز. حرام انه لا، خلينا نشوف كيف بدنا نعمل نحن ليجل ايد للامبلويز، كيف بدنا نشوف كيف بدنا نساعدهم بهذا المحل. والاقتراح يلي بيطلع هو الانشورنس ضد الران اواي. اذا صار في ران اواي انه يكون في ضمانه انه طيب كيف هيدا؟ ليش مين قال انه ترك البيت هو الامبلوير مش مسؤول عنه؟ هل فينا نعرف نحن أنه لما واحد بيترك البيت ترك البيت ليش؟ وبعدين بيجي الامبلوي مثلا بيضربها، ما بيدفع لها، بيصير اغتصاب، تعذيب، تجويع إلى آخره، وبالآخر هي بتترك البيت، بيروح بياخد المصاري من عند شركة التأمين. في حدا ممكن تركب براسه هيدي الشغلة؟ إذا ما في سيستم انفورسمنت حقيقي وما في سيستم مراقبة حقيقي للي عم بيصير جوات البيت، وقدرة أنه نحاسب الامبلوير اللي بيستعمل هيك وسائل، وقدرة الامبلويي أنه يدعي، عبسا نفعل هيدا الشيء. ساعتها الانشورنس رح تتنكر لواجباتها وهيدا السيستم ما رح يمشي، ورح تصير النزاع بين الانشورنس والامبلوير. فما بتصور أنه الواحد في راهن على هيدا السيستم أو هيدا ممكن يؤدي لأغراض. بنحكى عن robust enforcement and legal and policy norms. طيب كيف هيدا الانفورسمنت بده يصير إذا ما في ولا recommendation على تمكين الامبلويي بهيدا الريبورت؟ كيف بده يصير هيدا الانفورسمنت؟ هل يا ترى درسنا فعلا كيف السبونسر سيستم عم بيؤدي لمنع الاكسس تو جاستس؟ كيف عم بيؤدي انه يمنعها من اي طريقه؟ كيف عم تتوقف، تترحل، بدون ما حتى تقدر تشوف قاضي؟ كيف بدنا نحكي عن enforcement إذا كنا بهيدا الوضع؟ معناتها في شيء بدنا نرجع لورا فيه، وما في مهرب من أنه نبلش نضرب السيستم تبع السبونسر سيستم يلي هو أكيد هو السيستم يلي عم بيؤدي لهيدا النتائج السيئة. البانشمنت، شو البانشمنت؟ طيب أنا هون عندي ريبورت عم بيحكي عن فورس ليبر حقيقي وثبتوا هيدا الريبورت وهو سلاح، فشو عم احكي على انه على شغله صغيره، ولا انه بدها النيابات العامه فعلا تاخذ هيدا الريبورت وتعمل تحقيقاتها اللازمه لحتى تقدر توصل لنتائج توعي الناس وتوعي الامبلويرز انه هيك اعمال ممكن تؤدي لسيفير بانشمنت يلي هو جنايه ترافيك هيومن ترافيك. رابع recommendation, revise the contract by adding new provisions and clarifying others to reduce ambiguity. طيب عظيم، بس قلنا كمان شو مشاكل الكونتراكت، وبرجع بقول يعني انحكى شوي بالريبورت، بدي أعلق على هيدي النقطة انه ظاهر انه بعض البنود لما بتكون محطوطة بالكونتراكت في امل انه تتنفذ بشكل اكثر من غيرها. بس شو نحط بالكونتراكت؟ هو ما حطوا بالكونتراكت الا الشغلات يلي الامبلويرز حابين بيقبلوا ينفذوها. يعني ما وقتها صار مفاوضات كبيره، وكل المفاوضات كل ما واحد يحكي عن شيء ذا موست نورمال يقولوا لا 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 هيدا ما بينقبل، انه تطلع برات البيت. وليش بدها تطلع برات البيت مره واحده بالنهار، مره واحده بالجمعه؟ لازم كل ما تخلص الشغلات تقدر تطلع برات البيت. قد ايه بعدنا بعيد عن هيدا التفكير اصلا. فالكونتراكت اذا هو عم بيتنفذ اكثر من غيره لانه اصلا مش موجود فيه غير يلي كان الامبلويرز قبلانين ينفذوها وعم بينفذوها على ارض الواقع، وكل شيء تاني بده جهد وبده كذا نحط على برا وما نحط بالكونتراكت. فالحل مش الكونتراكت، علما انه في كونتراكت معمول بالاي ال او، شاركت فيه مع الاي ال او وانعمل وتناقش حتى بوزاره العمل، وبعده لهلا مثل كانه ما صار شيء، ما حدا عم بيرد عليه. فالكونتراكت موجود بس بالاضافه الى كل الاشياء الثانيه يلي لازم تصير. وحتى الكونتراكت لما بيصير اذا ما في طريقه للانفورسمنت ما عندها اي قدره انها تروح على القضاء، عبثا انه نفعل، ما رح نوصل لمحل. ف يعني حاجه ندور على اشياء صغيره نعدلها، بينما المشكله كبيره عم نجرب نتجنبها او نسيرها، بس هي رح تضلها كبيره وما رح تصغر بهدول الاشياء الصغيره. آخر شيء support better integration of domestic workers. أنا بتصور ما في integration حقيقية ممكن تصير إلا ينسمح للdomestic workers أنهم يحكوا عن مآسيهم ومظالمهم بالمساحة العامة وتحديدا قدام القضاء. يوم اللي بيصير عنا كذا قصة عم تحكي عن المأساة يلي عاشوها قدام القضاء، ساعتها أنا بتصور ممكن أنه يكون عم بحسوا هن أنه في نظام عم بيسمع لهم، عم بيخولهم أنهم يحكوا يعطوا صوتهم للآخر. بس لما بدل صوتهم مكتوم، وزير العمل بيرفض أنه يقعد مع ممثلين عنهم وبيعتبر نقابة للعاملات هي مؤامرة على البلد، فنحن منا ماشيين على باتجاه الانتجريشن. وبتأسف أنه فالريكومنديشنز أنا برأيي هن معمولين لغير الواقع للأسف يلي عم نعيش فيه. بس على كل بختم كلمتي شكرا كتير سوسن على الجهد الكبير، شكرا ILO، شكرا للكل لأنه زودتونا بمستند حقيقة رح نعرف نستعمله قدام النيابات العامة.
ضلك شوي. الوقت عم يداهمنا. Time is running out a little bit, so we're going to go quickly to the next part of the presentations, where we're going to have some comparative reflections on the actual report. First by Mr. Igor Bosk, who has joined the International Labor Organization Office in New York to lead the Work and Freedom Program, a technical cooperation project implemented in partnership with the UK Department Aid, aiming at reducing human trafficking and forced labor of women and girls from South Asia. Mr. Bosk will shed light on the global studies on migrant domestic work relevant to today's meeting and presentations, and will highlight findings from the perspective of countries of origin. I'll also go ahead and introduce the other speaker, Zaina Mizhir, and who will also be, in her presentation, present some comparative findings on research initiatives supported by the ILO, as well as work by other partners. So she'll also do a comparative presentation. And Zaina really quickly joined the ILO in 2011 to coordinate the migrant domestic workers related projects. Since 2015, she has also been coordinating Lebanon's labor migration program that includes her function as a national coordinator for the Work in Freedom Project for Lebanon. She represents the ILO in the National Steering Committee on Migrant Domestic Workers. So with that, I'll hand it over about 10 minutes each for the presentation, and then we'll hopefully have about 20 minutes time for discussion. Is that right, Zaina? Because you're involved in the... It's okay? That means we'll be a little running late, but we'll do our best to stay to our time. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I wanted to basically start by saying that I value a lot the discussions that were happening just before this and this morning. I think that the comments that are coming here on the recommendations are very valid, and at least as part of the Work in Freedom program, we will definitely take all these comments very seriously and look into how we can incorporate that. And there's a process that is as inclusive as possible of all the constituents. And just to note that we're doing very similar work in other countries, and in other countries we have always presented, we have in India particularly presented a very similar study that we have done both for employers of domestic workers in the city of Delhi as well as Mumbai. And in that context, for political reasons which are different from those of Lebanon, we were able to invite several domestic worker organizations, employers, and academics, and so on. So, if any of you are interested, particularly, I will be able to give more information about that later, and maybe during the lunch. So I was asked to. I'm just I'm giving a very basic overview of some of the basic statistics about migrant domestic workers. A lot of you may already know this, so I won't talk very much about that. And then I'll basically focus a little more about what has been done with employers of domestic workers in the region, and some of the findings and research that we're doing in this Working Freedom Program. Now, this Working Freedom Program covers 5 countries. We're looking at particularly countries of origin and countries of destination, but particularly in South Asia, Nepal, Bangladesh, India. India being both a country of source and country of destination, given the amount of internal migration, including a lot of domestic work happening within India itself. And of course, destination countries being, in addition to India, Jordan and Lebanon. So very quickly, just to put some facts here in the order of things, there are approximately 67.1 million domestic workers, of whom 11.5 are international migrants. And of course, these are very conservative figures and largely underestimated because of the amount of informality which is involved in the sector. So I just wanted to highlight that so that we have it there. Now, in terms of how does this compare in the Arab states, I think in the Asia region, you have a very high number of absolute number of migrant domestic workers, but particularly domestic workers. But in terms of proportion to basically women participating in the labor force, it's in the Arab world where it's the highest. And here you have a graph that indicates some of these trends. Now, what is the general demand? Particularly, I think we all know that in the Arab states there's a particularly low female participation in the workforce. I think it's around 26%. However, that's going to be, that's always, a dynamic figure, and it is expected that there will be some growth that will lead to greater demand of both migrant domestic workers and the demand for and also important to note that this growth is not yet driven by dual earners, like in the families, which is something which happens in other parts of the world. One of the main reasons for the demand is also, in addition to the need for work, is also social status. Employing domestic workers reflects employers' aspirations to higher social status, and there's several studies that have been done about that. Elderly care institutions are not favored. The decision to employ domestic workers is also motivated by tendency to frown upon aging relatives going to elderly institutions, and the cost of such institutions is also rather high. And of course, we talked about this relationship between with the employers. Now, I'll keep it there, and I just will say a couple more words about the research that we were doing have been doing in other countries. As I mentioned, in India, this is a quite significant research that has been done. There are very few research that have been done on the employer side. There has been a lot more that had been done, particularly on domestic workers. So this is also in South Asia sort of filling a gap of information that is very much needed. Now, what we have been finding, particularly in the case of India, is that contrary to a lot of the expectations, the process of recruitment within the recruitment. Very few actually employers reported that recruitment happened through any type of either formal or informal recruitment agencies. Less than 5% actually, and most of the recruitment was actually happening through kinship networks, which means that basically there is points to the importance of the informality within domestic work, particularly in South Asia. Another sort of very interesting finding was that employers were not ready. This doesn't come across here very much in this in the report we have done here, but employers were not ready to pay more money, increase the salaries if domestic workers had certified skills. In fact, so there's that which sort of comes in contrast, because a lot of the employers and a lot of all the media attention is focusing in India particularly a lot on the need for more skills. But if employers are not ready to pay more, then the likelihood that domestic work in South Asia will continue to be work which does not ensure decent work is likely to continue. So, I mean, that's one aspect of the research that we have been doing. Particularly, we have also been doing some research on recruitment of migrant domestic workers within all these regions. And one of the research that we did was from Bangladesh and Nepal to Lebanon, and so if you are interested, we can share some more information about that whole process, which I think in many cases you are familiar with and has been somehow discussed, and perhaps if not in this, if not this morning, but in other contexts here. And we've done also some, not the ILO, but there was a report on basically recruitment from Nepal to Lebanon and Jordan done by an organization called Verite back in 2012. So there's some significant information that is coming from recruitment, particularly labor recruiters. Now we have some information from in South Asia, and we're definitely looking forward to have other types of findings from employers. In Jordan, we have not yet done a quantitative study. I think there was a small study that was done last year around more of a qualitative study around employers of domestic workers, but we still have to do a more in-depth type of study if we could afford it. So anyway, that's a little bit the context. I would love to go into more details, but since we have little time, I'll leave it with that with Zaina.
Thank you all for staying. Just a small reminder that today we're not here to make a media stunt. It's not about a scoop. It's more about maybe restating the obvious, but that has been unaddressed for quite some time, and engage together in a discussion to keep the policy discourse related to domestic workers alive, given the very challenging context in Lebanon. So what I will be presenting is complementing what has been done in the earlier session. You have seen findings from the intertwined report that was launched today, and that shows the side of the employers. We have with us Rania here from CRI. We have conducted also with support from the European Union through another project by the ILO, the PROUD project, a survey on living and working conditions of domestic workers. So what I will be presenting is comparison between findings of these two reports, where things are confirmed and where there are interesting variations. And I will also link them to some other important studies that have been published over the past few years in Lebanon. Both surveys confirm that Ethiopians are the highest numbers employed in Lebanon, despite the ban, as also was mentioned by Nizar, although the figures in the two reports differ. The domestic workers report focus on the data from the Ministry of Labor, so the regular workers, while the other report takes into account those with irregular status. So the figures will change, because I hope you can go to the ILO migration website in the Regional Office of Arab State and have a look in depth at both reports. You can find them there. What I will be presenting is just, I picked on a few key areas and to show the similarities and differences in the findings. So in terms of profile and skills, the workers' survey showed that according to the workers, the employers are female, more likely to work, but they don't have much knowledge about the job of their employer or whether she is educated or not. In the employer survey, it is confirmed that the employers tend to be educated and working, or elderly adults in need of household assistance and care. A large majority of the domestic workers were either unemployed or unskilled before they come to work in Lebanon. While in the employer survey, it was clear that there is an increasing trend of hiring domestic workers to provide skilled help to an aging or ill member in a Lebanese family. 20.3% reported that they hire a live-in worker to take care of an elderly, versus 19.5% who reported needing her for someone with illness or a disability. And with this finding, in the study by CAFA and Legal Agenda and the Dreams for Sale, there is a quotation that I found it interesting. When she was asked about whether she needs any skills before going to Lebanon, the recruitment agency answered the domestic worker, "You won't be doing anything you don't already know. It's just basic cleaning work, like cleaning the windows and that kind of thing. Don't you know how to do that? How to iron clothes?" But I later found out that domestic work abroad is not like it is in Nepal. It is different. So even if it's not about skills needed to take care for an elderly or a child, even as a domestic work, apparently according to the domestic workers, they need to know more about they come to work in a country. In terms of findings related to the contract, and again, I'd like to remind that this is just a briefing, so a more detailed comparison, you can do it at your own ease later. In terms of contract, the workers' survey found that 88% of domestic workers signed a contract in Lebanon with internationality discrepancy. So it's not the same among all nationals. But in the employer survey, 73.8% do not receive a copy of the contract after signing it. So the employer confirmed that they don't give it to the worker. And only around half of the domestic workers read the contract, with the Philippines registering as the higher than average rate of 69%, and the Nepal recording a dismal rate of only 2%. And although the contract is for 1 year and it is renewable, 43.8% of the employers believe that it is for 3 years. And this is also a big problem when it comes to allowing the domestic worker to change employer or to travel or not. So the understanding of the duration of the contract is not also clear. 46% of domestic workers who lived in Lebanon for less than 3 years, and the duration of the initial contract with an employer before which they assume domestic workers may not leave the employer. So according to the domestic workers, they also assumed that she has to complete 3 years before she can ask to return to her country. And this information is confirmed with the understanding of the employer about that. So a question may arise here, who's giving this information? Is it the recruitment agency? Is it just it became a fact known to all? Because the contract is signed for 1 year only. The work permit is for 1 year only. The work permit is for 1 year only. So this is something to look at. And again, according to Dream for Sale, out of the participants of the survey, 60% signed work contracts in one of the 2 countries of origin before heading to Lebanon. However, 60% did not understand the terms of the contract. So they signed, but they didn't know what they signed on. Regarding the salary, the employer survey states that more than 35% were paying less than $200 a month. It's confirmed with the worker survey, whose 80% of Bangladeshis earn 200 or less, and the majority earn the average of around $180 a month. 80% of the domestic workers reported always getting paid on time. 60% of the employer say that they pay at the end of the month. Now, this finding may sound, although it's alarming that 20% don't get paid on time, but I missed to mention something at the beginning of my presentation, is the sample is already biased. The survey sample of the domestic workers survey were only domestic workers who were allowed to leave the house. So they were live-in domestic workers with regular status, but those were interviewed either in the street or in gathering places or in the markets. So the possible victims of forced labor were not part of the survey. So, of course, that gives us some of the findings to be biased. 23% reported that money was deducted by their employer, and 63% of those believed that it was to pay the Lebanese agency. According to the employer survey, 36.3% who paid recruitment fees of $2,000 or less, and 54.3% who paid more than $2,000 in recruitment fees remunerated the first 3 months' salary to the agency, although this is clearly against the law to deduct from the worker's salary and remunerate the agency. And according to the Dreams for Sale, 50% of those surveyed said that their wages were not paid on a monthly basis, and 40% stated that their employers deducted the equivalent of an average of 3 months' wages. At some point, we can also discuss that there is a difference in the methodology between the Dreams for Sale and the worker survey, and the number of those interviewed in the Dreams for Sale versus the number of interviewed in the worker survey, which also may show why there are some discrepancies in both. Regarding the day off and freedom of movement, in the worker survey, 36% get 1 day off per week. It doesn't mean that it is outside the house, but they get 1 day off. And in the employers survey, the figure is that 57.3% work 7 days a week. 56.3% of employers believe that they have the right to lock a worker inside. They believe they have this right and they engage in this practice. What's alarming is that 37.1% of those who know that they don't have that right still engage in this. So they know it's not their right, but nevertheless they do it. And 1/3 of domestic workers are sometimes locked inside their employer's home, according to the domestic workers survey. The difference between the two groups is significant and suggests that correct knowledge in this case does affect actual practice. Hence, without opening the discussion with Nizar, why it is relevant to reach out to employers who don't know. So while we have serious practices that needs policy work and needs monitoring and enforcement by the authorities, there are some employers who do not know their rights and obligations, so reaching out to them might also help the domestic workers not to fall victim. So this is why that recommendation, I think, is valid to enlighten the employers about what is right and what's not. In the workers' survey regarding the living conditions, 50% have their private bedrooms, 80% of those are Filipinos and Nepalese, and 38% Bangladeshis. Now, the other 50%, 13% sleep in the living room, 11% in the kitchen, and 11% in a glass-enclosed balcony. Comparing that figure to the employer survey, the employers said that 69.3% provide a private bedroom, 40%, the other percentage, 14% sleep in the living room, 5% in the children's bedroom, 4% in the kitchen, and 4% on a balcony. I would love to sleep on a balcony. Differences in compliance depending on the nationality of my domestic worker, which also hints to the importance of the empowerment of the domestic workers to demand their rights, because in the survey we noticed that the Filipinos tend to enjoy more rights than the others, and it has to do with that maybe they have been longer in the country, they have a very active network, their embassy is also proactive in demanding their rights. And we noticed that the employers who complied the least with the rights relating to the personal freedom of the migrant domestic workers is when the right is not stipulated in the contract, which confirmed what Nizar was saying. So if the right is not in the contract, they can dismiss themselves from fulfilling that right. And in the contract, there's only very frail provisions anyway. Regarding recruitment agency, in the worker survey, around 3/4 of domestic workers were recruited through an agency in their home country. Only half of them ever had any contact with recruitment agencies in Lebanon. 60% of the domestic workers paid the agency in their home country with no notable internationality discrepancies, except for Nepalese, 90% of whom reported paying the recruitment agency. And 11% contacted the recruitment agency in Lebanon seeking help. In the employers survey, 87.4% of employers recruit through an agency. Employers are unaware that they can recruit directly without resorting to an agency. And 16.8% of the employers responded that the agent is a friend. Regarding rights and what to do in case of conflict, more than 60% of the domestic workers stated that they had no one to resort to in case of employment conflict. Only around 2% declared having received help from a local or international NGO. 13% stated that they were given information pamphlets about their rights, a share that is significantly higher for Nepali and Filipino. In the employer survey, 9 out of 10 employers described as important the agency's willingness to mediate in case of conflict as a criteria to select their agency versus another. And employers do not actively seek to improve their individual knowledge on the rights and obligations under the law, and instead rely on second-hand information and substitute decision-making. The primary information source for the employer is the recruitment agency. According to a recent report that was published by Issam, entitled Trapped, 64.3% of employers reported that when conflict in the employment relationship arise, they address the problems themselves. So they don't even resort to the agency, nor definitely the Ministry of Labor. On kafala sponsorship, the worker survey did not cover the definition of kafala as such, so it's indirectly addressed. But in the employer survey, 12 to 19.5% of employers do not know what is covered by kafala. 57.7% believe that kafala protects their rights. 64.1% believe that kafala protects the right of domestic workers. And 29.9% expressed the view that kafala puts undue responsibility on employers. According to Issam study, 39% of employers reported that kafala should be abolished, while 36.4% reported that it should be changed to make it easier for employers. Comparing the recommendations, the domestic worker survey recommends that awareness raising should reach Lebanese households regarding entitlement of migrant domestic workers to equal rights and protection. And also reach out to migrant domestic workers themselves about the decent work of domestic worker, and that this should be addressed not just in the Lebanon when they arrive to Lebanon, but also to start pre-departure in countries of origin, like the case of Philippines. And in terms of legal framework, to regularize domestic work by including domestic workers in the labor law and eliminating the kafala system. Moreover, the domestic workers may be given free legal support through pro bono legal consultation through NGOs. We went quickly through the recommendations with Nizar, but I'll just briefly mention them. That in the employer survey also, it stipulates the necessity to reach out to employers due to their lack of knowledge on their rights and obligations. Also, to address the lack of regulation of recruitment agency to eliminate fee charging for workers and reduce recruitment costs for employers. Nizar spoke about the incentives and the revision of the standard unified contract. The revision of the standard unified contract is also elaborated in the Issam report, and they go in depth of why it should be revised. And in the employer survey, it also addresses the importance of supporting the empowerment and better integration of migrant domestic workers in Lebanese society and recognize their social rights and freedom. Additional recommendations outside these two reports from the other two studies is to train and support employers. Because, for example, it's interesting, in the Issam report, they considered that in the domestic work sphere, often employers are not used to manage somebody else. It's not a job, or the women are not, never worked before, so they don't know how to manage and supervise an employee. So that some tools can be developed towards that, and to improve the access of domestic workers to information in their country of origin, to prosecute those who violate the rights of workers in Lebanon, which resonate with what Nizar was saying. Anyway, this is a legal agenda, also co-publication, and adopt practical policy measures to limit forced labor and trafficking. That's it in terms of comparison.
No, I just wanted to say one thing very quickly, is in terms of, in strict methodological terms, it is not possible to compare two or several different types of studies which have different sampling methods. However, the point of this analysis is to look at different perspectives, looking at the same problem from a different perspective, and that's why I think it's important to see this. But strictly speaking, you know, it's not something. These were studies that were done in different periods with different people, and therefore, you know, basically coming up with conclusions about what this can mean is not wouldn't be the right way to go. But it is important, at least, to see the different perspectives of how each study addresses the same issue.
Yeah. And also adding to that, I hope that from the discussions of this morning until now, it can inform the next session. I mean, we're going to have 20 minutes of discussion, but then we're going to break for lunch. So I sincerely hope that many of you can stay and reflect with us in the afternoon on how we can bring this and link it to the care economy, which is the main theme of today. So thank you for listening. And I give the floor to Rayan to manage the discussion.
I want to try to... We have about 20 minutes for discussion. I wanted to see if we wanted to focus our discussion on the actual presentation and the discussants as opposed to the comparative studies, or do you want to just invite everybody up? We'll open up the floor, get questions, and see where it goes. Seems like the latter. So why don't we invite the speakers to come up, and I will open up the floor and maybe take 2 or 3 questions at a time, and then, yes, go ahead. Wait for the microphone, and can you please introduce yourself before speaking?
Hello. Thank you. Zainab Hanna from Amal Association. Thank you very much for these presentations and the valuable numbers. Comparing a couple of years ago, there was really a scarce of information and percentages, but it's really key for us to rely the services and the capacity building and the advocacy and the process of intervention that the civil society is conducting next to the INGOs. I just wanted to highlight one issue regarding some of the comments that were addressed. Definitely the study is a great tool for us to build on future research and build on the intervention. But in our experience with Amal Association, the issue of migrant domestic workers can never be tackled from one point of view. It can never be only legal or social, or it's a multi-layer level, and we all agree that the sponsorship system should not be here. It's not comparable to any human rights to restrict the fundamental freedom of a person, but definitely the response should be on a multi-layer, being the advocacy, the awareness raising, the capacity building, the research, and all the interventions that are conducted. So it's true that the issue is challenging, but sometimes it may be very surprising to hear the other point of view from the country of origin that could be sometimes easing. Lebanon is very critical about itself, which is really key, and this will allows us to be moving forward in comparison to the Gulf and other countries. But definitely, we believe we are on the right track, and this is really, we thank you again for all of this, and we'll be very happy to share the experience of Amel on some layer, and all of us NGOs are coordinating together, which is really very important. It's very exemplary that we succeeded to come together and move forward in this level. Definitely there are lots of challenges on the political level, but we think we are on the right track, and thank you so much.
مرحبا، أنا ما عرفت عن حالي هذيك الساعة. أنا اسمي غادة جبور من منظمة كفا. بدي أعلق شوي على اللي نزار قالوا. بالنسبة أول نقطة بالنسبة للتوعية، توعية أصحاب العمل عن نظام السبونسرشيب. أنت طرحت تساؤل ليش بدنا نوعيهم. بتخيل هذا الشيء نتج لأنه في إيبوتيز، في فرضية كمان لقيناها نحن بالتعاطي مع employers بلبنان. البعض بيقول إنه أنا ما فيني أسمح للعاملة تظهر، لأنه إذا ارتكبت جرم، إذا سرقت، إذا خبطت السيارة وانقتلت، أنا حكون قانونيا مسؤول عن هذا الشيء. في جزء عن جد فعلا مقتنع إنه هو مسؤول قانونيا أمام الدولة إذا العاملة ارتكبت أي مخالفة أو صار عليها مخالفة. فبالتالي هذا عم يمنع بعض الامبلويرز بعض الامبلويرز عم بقول من انه ما يعطوا كامل الحريه للعامل. من هيدي الناحيه، من هيدا الانجل الضيق، بتصور لازم يتحكى مع الامبلويرز بلبنان ويتفصل انه هيدا الشيء مش مزبوط قانونيا، وهيدا الشخص نثبت فكره انه عنده كيان قانوني خاص. وهيدي نقطه انا بعتبرها مهمه، مع انه بتعبر مثل ما لقينا بالدراسه عن جزء صغير مش بالضروره كل. النقطه الثانيه اللي حكيت فيها واللي هي انه القرارات ان كان بالنسبه للعقد او غير سياسات متبعه بلبنان تتاخذ من دون مشاركه العاملات، هيدي نقطه جوهريه. الكونترا انعمل بال 2009 بستيرينج كوميتي بلجنه تيسيريه انعملت على صعيد الوزاره، كان فيها جمعيه وحده من لبنان. وما صار في طبعا اكيد مشاركه للعاملات، وقتها كانوا السفرات والجمعيه هي ريبريزنتينج مصلحه العاملات. هالشغله نحن هلا بال 2016 عم ترجع تنعاد بعدم وجود العاملات. في ستيرينج كوميتي الايالو فيها جمعيه وحده على اساس عم بتمثل كل المجتمع المدني، ومش صحيح لانه ما عم بتشارك معنا شيء فيها، والعاملات مش موجودين. هيدا الشيء عم بينعاد هلا بموافقه الكل، بعدم تساؤل واضح عن هيدا الشيء، بعدم مساءله للوزاره عن هيدا الشيء، عم بيتاخذ قرارات باسم العاملات، والعاملات ما عم بيقدروا يعطوا رايهم. واليوم ما في مني شايفه ولا اي عامله بالصاله، يمكن مغلطه بس انا مني شايفه ولا اي عامله بالصاله، وهيدا شيء كثير الواحد بيطرح علامه التساؤل. في ترجمه ليش مش موجود؟ يعني لوجستيا فيهم يكونوا رابور عنهم، الحكي عنهم. فهودي النقطتين اللي انا حابه ضروري كثير الستيرينج كوميتي، وهذا يا ريت كانت موجوده عم تمثل الوزير، ينعرض ليش مش موجودين العاملات. يعني ما بده يعترف بالنقابه وهذا شيء هجين، طيب يعترف بوجود العاملات حتى كمان هذا الشيء بده ينكر عليهم وجودهم.
كمان نزار.
لا بس جواب سريع. انا قلت اول شيء الامبلويرز، يعني عم نحكي عن شريحه كتير كبيره بلبنان، يعني كانوا عم نقول الراي العام كل الناس، مش انه ايه بس. لا لما بقول بدي وعي الامبلويرز يعني كانه بدي وعي كل اللبنانيين، يعني مش انه بقى كيف بدي وعيهم عبر الاعلام، ولا بعمل نشاطات تريننج وكذا، انه هي راي عام. فكيف بدي وعيهم بانه روح احكي مع كل واحد جمعهم، ولا انه عبر دعاوى، عبر معارك بدها تصير على هيدي الحقوق لحتى تمس فيهم بشكل كبير؟ شو هي الاكثر شيء فعاله؟ وانا هيدا بس انا كان التعليق تبعي الاكبر انه قدام ريبورت بهالخطوره هيدي كيف ممكن تكون هيدي اول ريكومنديشن؟ يعني في مشكل منهجي فيها. مش ممكن ان واحد يوصل على هيدي الريكومنديشن من هيدا الريبورت، او ممكن حتى وحده من السكندري فيري سكندري كمان شيء اخر شيء، بس مش يبلش فيها.
نسيت نقطة بس منيح قراية الحكى. هي بالملخص تبع الدراسة الثانية اللي موجود بالفولدر في ريكومنديشن موجهة للامبلويرز لأصحاب العمل إنه يكون في نقابة لأصحاب العمل. أنا صراحة هيدي الشغلة بعتبرها كتير خطرة، إنه الآيلو تشجع إنه يصير في نقابة. هلأ بالوضع الحالي بلبنان بالكونتكست اللي موجود حاليا بلبنان إنه ينعمل شغل على هذا الصعيد. يعني نحن قتلنا ونسفنا كل الافورتس اللي ممكن ينعملوا بالنسبه للعاملات، لانه التريد يونيون تبعهم ما حدا عم بيعترف فيها. هلا موجوده بالصفحه 4 Lebanese household. Moreover, a syndicate of employers may be formed to represent their interests and express their views. هيدي الشغله اذا انحطت بالخطوط الاماميه نحن عم نجهض اي اعتراف بالنقابه اللي موجوده، عم نحط بالامام مصالح اصحاب العمل اللي هن واصلين لنا، لانه كل الكونتكست بيدعم. بس حبيت اقول هالشغله.
دكتور سوسن.
بس أنا maybe I can close this point if there are questions. The question will move us into a different direction. I just want to say that I am in full agreement with Nizar that we really need to have a human rights approach to this issue, and the situation is really unacceptable. What I wanted to clarify is that the results showed that on some issues, the employers don't know. You may say, well, the employers don't want to know, okay. But on some issues related to the contract and the kafala and other legal issues, the employers don't know. So the first step that we would present is that you need all the employers to know about what the legal framework is. The second step is that if there are certain stipulations in the contract, no matter how weak the contract is, and the fact that yes, there are statements in the contract that say, according to what is acceptable in Lebanese culture or to the Lebanese family, and you can't have something like this in the contract, no matter how weak the contract is. If there are stipulations that say you have to pay the salary at the end of the month, you have to give 1 day of rest, the worker cannot work more than 12 hours a day, then if there are at least these minimum basic regulations, then the next step is to actually make sure that the employers abide by these. But I fully acknowledge that the whole issue of what happened, what is going on with the migrant domestic workers is an issue related to oppression and structural inequalities and gender and, of course, and human rights abuses. And we have to address this heads on, but we also have to understand the context in which the ILO was written, that, this is a document that the ILO wanted to use for, building bridges with, the international community, or trying to work on some policies with the Ministry of Labor. So just to see it in that context, not to apologize or not to explain, but
discussing no problem.
Not to justify.
يعطيكم العافية. أنا اسمي فرح عبد الله، أنا من الفيناسول، الاتحاد الوطني لنقابات العمال والمستخدمين في لبنان. للأسف النقابة اليوم منا هون لأنه ما توجه لدعوة، ونسأل عن هذا الموضوع وكمان ما رد علينا بهذه النقطة. فللأسف العاملات اليوم منهم موجودين هون، وبعتقد ما في ممثل عن أصحاب العمل، صح؟ بالجمهور يعني بما انه هن لا مش عم بحكي، لا بس توضح انه يعني حتى التارجتد جروب او بالعنوان الدراسه منهم موجودين. هذه نقطه. ثاني نقطه انه دائما ضلنا عم نتعامل مع موضوع العاملات بالخدمه المنزليه as victims. هيدي الابروش نغيرها بقى سنس انه صار في نقابه، سنس انه الدفاع عن الحقوق الاقتصاديه والمناصره لوجود هيدي النقابه وامباورينج هيدي النقابه مفروض يكون شيء صار مبثوث، يعني او شيء صار نحط على الطريق مش نتراجع عنه. الحلول التامين على الكونترا لنرد لصاحب العمل اذا فلت هربت البنت والخ، هيدي حلول منا مستدامه. نحن اللي عم نبش عليه عن حلول مستدامه بترجع مش بس للمورال، لانه بين بالدراسه انه في ناس بتعرف انه غلط وبتعمل انه غلط، وحتى اذا علمنا كل العالم انه في غلط حيضل في ابيوزز. اذا ما كان في شيء ليجل، ما كان في قانون، ما فينا نتكل على حسن اخلاق اصحاب العمل او حسن اخلاق الموظف. لازم يكون في سيستم معين يتطبق، ومش بس السيفل سوسايتي تكون مندمجه فيه، لانه نحن اللي بقينا اليوم سيفل سوسايتي فلت وزاره العمل والعاملات منهم موجودين. بالتالي هيدا الديالوج بما انه نحن كلنا بنفس الكون تقريبا، ما فينا نجي نقول انه مشاركه هيدي الريزلتس تاع الدراسه بس معنا. بصراحه منا بناءه لانه المعنيين الاساسيين منهم موجودين.
Sure. Is it quick?
It's quick.
Okay. We have four more hands.
Okay. Just quickly as I'm here. Maddie Maxwell Hard, project coordinator from AML Association. I just had two small questions on the recommendation 3. Firstly, if this social and financial incentive for employers has been put into practice elsewhere, in Jordan, for example, and what have the outcomes of this been? And secondly, I'm questioning the focus solely on the incentives for implementation rather than also incorporating sanctions for non-implementation.
over here, and then there's a question over there, and then we'll come back to the, well, what was?
You want us to answer first?
No, I think I wanted to get some more, then give you a chance at the end. لا إذا بدك.
No, go ahead.
Rada, I think you have raised very important points, and you're waiting for the ILO to give you an answer, right? But I think you also know very well the difficulties that we have found in all this work. We have been in this business for more than 10 years, actually 15 years in Lebanon, and many, many actors have tried. We have studied the whole issue, left, right, and center. We know it all pretty much. We have all the activists, the international organizations, the unions, everybody's there. Everybody knows what the issues are. But we also have an interlocutor that this morning, did not even stay with us for 1 minute to respond to your questions. So it is very, very difficult. We are operating on an extremely sensitive ground whereby the steering committee is locked, basically. We have tried to open it up. We have tried to make suggestions. We have. But unfortunately, we're not able to go where we would like to be. So I take all your criticism, and I think it is very important that someone from the civil society brings this up all the time. At the same time, and the same, I take FENASOL, a very dear partner to the ILO, and yes, there are no workers here. We know that very well. And it is painful every time we organize something, the fact that it's sensitive to have the workers. So how do we operate in this? I don't have the answer all the time. We have...
Black.
Why is it sensitive?
Yeah. And why couldn't you share the minutes of the meeting if you didn't succeed in allowing the steering committee to open up and making the steering committee more open? Can't you just share the internal discussions and take the opinion of domestic workers, take the opinion of other civil society organizations, make workshops around it? We can't be there physically, and it's not very important, but at least to know what's happening. There's like we don't know what's happening, and decisions might be made, although I'm not convinced that the minister will take any decision. But the process is carried out without really any consultation. That's my, it's not, don't take it personal. It's not that it is, we have to really open up. If we allow the minister to be more closed, we're just giving a green light to decisions that may not reflect the interest of the workers. That's it.
Yeah, I think my colleague will be able to provide you with some of this information.
You want to respond, Zaina, and then we have more questions? If you want to respond, go ahead.
I hope that this discussion does not turn into, a ball between us. It's not, we're all in this together. We're trying our best to think outside the box to come up with solutions. We are not leading the National Steering Committee. So there are things that we have to respect, that this is how it's done. If the Ministry of Labor wants to share the minutes of meeting, then we can share them. If they don't want to share the minutes of meetings, we are not entitled to share them. But what we are doing is the initiatives that are taking shape within the steering committee, we're doing consultations around them. For example, the one initiative that was criticized, and if I have time at the very end, I can offer more explanations about it, which is the insurance scheme. You are being consulted on the insurance scheme, and when something, it's still didn't take shape, but when there is something that will take shape, you will be invited to a roundtable discussion around it. This is our role. We facilitate a dialogue, and we are a tripartite organization. Why one of the recommendations in the workers' survey is to have a employer syndicate is because today the discussion is between the employer and the recruitment agency, the worker and the recruitment agency, there is no dialogue between these two. And this is important. We're not saying to empower the worker, but to create a space where there is a discussion around the interest of these two parties together. So this was the heart of that recommendation.
Just one answer regarding Jordan. I think there was a question regarding, on the incentives. I think your questions are very good. Also, the comments that Nijar provided. And that's something that we would like to have in the discussions that will follow when they have some findings about this. Now, in Jordan particularly, it's actually only been starting to be implemented since 3 months. So in reality, it's very small moment, a very small time to actually be able to draw any conclusions as of yet. But the legislation is there, and if you're interested, we can provide that information so that you have it. Also, I just wanted to highlight so that it is clear, there was a complaint that was filed, I think, in 2013 about the steering committee not having basically space for representation of workers. And the ILO basically asked, from the headquarters, asked the government of Lebanon to provide basically a response. And that is still pending. So that's just to let you know that there is a process which is ongoing that involves our own headquarters with this particular issue, and we know very well that it would be very much recommended to have workers' participation fully represented in the steering committee.
Sorry, one more clarification, not to sound defensive, but some domestic workers were invited today. The NARI group were invited today. MCC were invited as well. Unfortunately, the one dear baby was not invited, and which is the Domestic Workers Union, but the others were invited. They did not come because maybe of the circumstances of their work. They work, it's a Monday, they didn't leave, but we are not completely excluding. We're trying our best to also have the voice of the workers here.
Okay, I think what we're gonna do is take the couple of questions left, and then we'll just give 1 minute each for the speakers, and that's what I'm proposing to close off the session. Otherwise, it'll continue, and I think some of this can be taken up in the policy suggestions in the next sessions.
I came late this morning, so I don't know if my mudakhala is going to be redundant or... but what I find very interesting about our discussions on employers is, first of all, I always feel like we need to take a step back and just to kind of see how are we profiling or viewing employers. And employers can mean so many things. And I briefly looked at the study right now, and I saw some quantitative analysis on the different types of employers. But when we come to approach employers and their attitudes and behaviors towards domestic workers, often I find the way of thinking really either homogenizes them, they're all bad, or we dichotomize them. Some are good and some are bad. So I would really like to see, and sorry if we already talked about this, but a way of viewing employers across a spectrum and seeing how it goes from being an abusive employer towards rights-based employers. And this is the approach of EQUIP, that we really want to try to guide employers around the along this continuum to kind of change their attitudes and behaviors towards a more rights-based. So when we view employers in this way, then we can, and we do believe that we can change their normalized abusive behaviors and their practices. The second point I'd like to say is I really do think we need to raise awareness among employers and guide them on how to implement decent employment practices, because at the end of the day, given the context that we're in Lebanon and our weak laws or our non-existing laws, and where we do have laws, there's no enforcement, at the end of the day, it's a domestic worker behind the closed door with the employer. So the only source of information that the employer has access to is either her neighbor, who has also normalized the same abusive practices, or the recruitment agent. So for us to be able to access the live-in domestic worker, we need to have the buy-in. We need to have access to the employer or the recruitment agency who can refer their clients to us. And this is why I think we should make employers, our strategies should include employers, because MCC and NIRE Group and all these amazing groups do such a great job, but they're targeting more the freelancers or those that already have a day off. What EQUIP really cares about, and I'm sure what most of us care about, is how to access the live-in domestic worker, which means that we have to include employers and recruitment agencies in our equation. And obviously the best way to do that is to start from the top, which is from a policy level. But given Lebanon's political or policy infrastructure, what maybe we can do, and this is what EQUIP wants to do, is find a way of providing services. And here we offer over 10 services that we're confident if employers have access to these services, it's going to help professionalize and improve the employment relationship. Because once you have a failed attempt at an employment relationship as an employer, you're going to try again. You're going to try 3 times. But at the end of the day, you need somebody that you can rely. You're opening your house to somebody that's coming into your household. So we need to give them the tools to ensure that this employment relationship is going to be sustainable and professional. And I think it is in the interest of the employer, and we need to kind of let them see that this is their interest, to invest in the employment relationship. Some are going to be very ready for it. Others won't even consider it. But with time, I feel it will pick up.
Okay, we have one more question in the back, and then we're just going to have 1 more minute for each of the speakers.
Hi, I'm Aya Adra. I'm a political psychology student here at AUB. I have a couple of questions for Dr. Sausan. When I heard about the fact that this conference is focusing on the attitudes of employers, there were a couple of things I was hoping to hear about. And they were neither in the presentation nor in the report, but they might have come up in the interviews. So the first one is, what scares the employers? So what scares them? So they obviously know that there are things in the contract that they are violating. So what would stop them from doing so? Is it, this is a question as an activist, is it pairing up migrant domestic workers with lawyers, so the legal side? Or is it things like the embassy support, things like media leakage, that the domestic worker can take a video and give it to media, so reputation concerns? What would scare the employers enough to stop violating these provisions? And the second one is, since the data was collected in 2015, I was hoping to get some of the attitudes of employers towards migrant domestic workers as political agents. So by that time, we already had the unionizing efforts that were starting, things like the march on Labor Day. So did you get any feel of how the employers think of migrant domestic workers in the public sphere as political agents? Thank you.
Let me start with the second question because it's a quicker answer. That year the Domestic Workers Union had started, and we only unfortunately included one question related to whether the employer would allow the worker to attend an organizational meeting or a union meeting. And the overwhelming majority of employers said no, they don't want that. Of course, I mean, with respect to what would scare the employers into following the legal framework, or into following the law, or not violating the rights of migrant domestic workers. This is very complicated. Even the issue of letting the employers know that there is something in the contract about 12 hours a day, giving a full day of rest. This has to work in synergy with also working at the level of basically penalizing employers who violate the minimum standards that are included in the contract. But there's also, the work that is being done by some NGOs that were mentioned already, who are here and some who are not here. There is a project that is at the core is an anti-oppression, anti-racism project that needs to move ahead because a lot of the problems that are encountered, that violations of migrant domestic workers, have much deeper roots related to racializing individuals from certain parts of the world, have roots in the issue of gender inequality and the lack of respect for domestic work. And they have roots in capitalism. The employer wants to get the most labor at the minimum cost. And they are in a context where they pay, most of the money they pay goes to the recruitment agencies. This creates this dysfunctional relationship with the worker. Not to mention that the worker is in the employer's home as well. So it's a very intimate relationship, but it's a dysfunctional relationship at the same time. And there is something structurally wrong with it. And also, there is the issue that the alternative of hiring someone from 9 to 5 is not there. Nobody talks about it. Why? In many other parts of the world, those who can afford it would hire someone from 9 to 5. And the person works from 9 to 5, they get a lunch break, they have their autonomy at the end of the day, they can do whatever they want. And the relationship remains a work relationship rather than a relationship of having someone to serve the employer around the clock. So I don't know if this answered any, but these are some of the, if we don't talk about recommendations in a generic recommendations in a report, and we want to talk more freely about what should be done, then some of the things that I just mentioned.
Or then join us to the next session.
You know what? I think what I'm going to do is just allow everybody to respond. If you want to start for 1 minute, and then we're going to close off the session. So if you want to go ahead.
Okay, I just wanted two very quick issues. One, I think, is there's a lot of discussion about how to shift the attitude of employers, and I think some of the findings can definitely help. And I think there's some work that is being conducted by CAFA on shifting these types of behaviors. Now, I think in the case of Lebanon, we have to, and most of the Middle East, it's important to be, I guess, realistic about how the economy is going and how it's affecting cost of living, how it's affecting employers as well. And in such a context, to try to influence the attitudes of employers is sort of is almost running against the mainstream of the course. But it is important, and it is important particularly to make sure that you have, that there is discrimination doesn't become even more accentuated with periods of economic stagnation. Where, say, middle-class employers who have less and less money to be able to afford, but nevertheless might need some workers, may recourse to basically attitudes of discrimination. And that's something which I think is important to keep in mind. The second issue, very quickly, I think is basically about the notion that migrant workers require skills. I think if in South Asia, being based there, hundreds of millions of women are actually working at home, and they're not being remunerated for what they're doing. And therefore, then asking for them, once they actually move out and saying that they need to have skills after they've been working for lifetimes actually at home, is a little bit challenging. And you can understand that there are some technical issues that are important, but what is really more important from our perspective in the program that we're doing is not the technical skills, but more the skills which are related to rights awareness, and how is it that the, migrant workers understand situations of disempowerment, first in contact with the sub-agents, first contact with, say, for example, the employer, first time the employer asks for the passport. What are the types of possible reactions that can actually lead you to further disempowerment, and what are the types of reactions that can lead you to more empowerment? And that's a type of sort of more active skills which are really more important that I wanted to highlight.
I don't really, I just wanted to end my part by just saying that I think it's really interesting that there's an open dialogue here, and you have different actors who know each other very well. You're calling each other by first name basis, so very important the work that you're doing. I just would wonder or wish, my final note, that you open up the dialogue to actors that are on the periphery, perhaps, but are really a source of the problem. You mentioned capitalism. I would really like to see discussions from private sector coming in to see how can we help to partner on some of these issues.
أنا بدي أرجع أكرر شكري اللي عملوا الدراسة لأنها كتير مهمة وبرجع بدعيهم بكل صراحة إنه لازم تتعدى الريكومنديشنز. برجع بقول مش ممكن يكون أول ريكومنديشن هي الأويرنس تبع الإمبلويرز. مين بده يعمل الأويرنس؟ يعني لما بتعرفوا إنه كل الدعاوى اللي كانوا عم بيقدموها أرباب العمل أصحاب العمل ضد العاملات يلي تركوا البيوت كانت عم تقول سرقة، ومين كان عم بينصحهم بالسرقة؟ المخافر. فالاويرنس انا اذا بدي اكون محامي وبيتلفن لي امبلوير بيقول لي اشرح لي السبونسر شيب سيستم، بقول له بيقدر فيك تعمل يلي بدك وما بيقدروا يحاسبوك. فاذا هيدي هي التايب اوف اويرنس لوين بدنا نوصل فيها؟ فالا اذا مثل ما قالت غاده بدنا ناخذ 1 2 3 ونقول هيدول ما بحق لكم تعملوهم، بس مهم شو ما يعملوا ما فينا نحاسبهم طالما هيدا السيستم موجود. فخلينا يعني اذا في شويه موارد مش ممكن تنحط بالاويرنس تبع الامبلويرز، لازم تنحط على الاويرنس تبع الامبلويز، على كيف بدنا نامن لهم ليجل ايد بطريقه مناسبه، مش حتى تنتهي بالكومبرومايز مثل ما عم بيصير احيانا مع هيومانيتاريان اورجانيزيشنز للاسف. فهيدا الشيء اللي بده يكون. فدائما بالموارد بده واحد يشوف انه ايه كل شيء منيح كل شيء حلو، وانا اذا بقدر اروح لعند كل امبلوير واشرح له هيك اوكي، بس انا عندي وقت محدود. هذا الوقت المحدود وين بدي استعمله؟ روح عند القاضي اطلع على الاعلام واحكي بالموضوع، ولا روح عند كل امبلوير؟ فلما بدها تنعمل ريكومنديشن هيك بدنا نفهمها انه انا عم بحول الموارد للامبلويرز، وهيدي انا برايي الغير مناسبه ابدا.
I will yield my time to all the points.
Well, thank you for all the food for thought. There's definitely, it will always be a very multi-layered subject, and we don't claim, we can't promise that we're gonna solve it all in no time, but we feel that this dialogue, as maybe Charlotte just said, that this dialogue to open up about the issues, but also agree on how we can put invest our resources, our time, because this is not a favorable time to address migrant domestic workers issues. And it's very important to keep in mind, I'm saying this out of a very personal experience, if this care economy is not taken care of, is not addressed, the whole Lebanese society can collapse. We depend so much on domestic workers, but we're still not doing enough to try to make them want to come to Lebanon and stay in Lebanon. So this is why I think the next session, which will be about all this reflection, bringing it to some practical entry points that we can take with us again to the steering committee, although some of you don't like the steering committee, but it's still a space where something is happening, where dialogue is initiated with governmental organizations. And I feel this is important. I mean, without a policy change, we cannot influence the 250 domestic workers that are in Lebanon. So thank you all for attending this session. And Ryan will invite us to lunch now, I think.
I think it's over here, right?
For 1 hour. And we will be back to this room, and based on how many we are, we will either divide into groups, into another group, or we will engage on the questions regarding the care economy in this form. We can come back here at what time, Ryan? Now?
Yeah, we're an hour.
Two will be okay for you, democratically? Okay, so we meet back here at 2, please.